She had nothing, no home, no savings, no one who noticed when she was gone. He had everything, billions in the bank, towers with his name on them, a son who called him daddy and meant the whole world. They should never have crossed paths. But every morning, in a small cafe most people drove past without a second look, a billionaire sat close enough to watch a dying woman count pennies for a cup of coffee, and did something that cost him almost nothing. He saw her. That one small act would unravel him completely and rebuild him into someone he never expected to become. If this story moves you, hit like and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. Now stay with me, because this is where it begins. The alarm on Nathan Mercer's phone went off at 4:47 every morning. Not 4:45, not 5 o'clock. Exactly 4:47, a habit left over from the early days when he used to catch the 5:15 bus to his first job at a shipping warehouse in South Portland, Maine. He'd kept the alarm long after the buses became town cars and the warehouse became a corner office on the 34th floor. Some things stuck around not because they were useful anymore, but because they were true. That alarm was one of them. He lay in bed for a moment in the dark, listening. The penthouse was always too quiet at this hour. 4,200 square feet of silence, marble floors that reflected the city lights coming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, custom furniture that a designer he'd never personally met had selected based on a mood board he'd approved in a 12-minute meeting. The place looked exactly like what a 32-year-old billionaire's home was supposed to look like. It felt like almost nothing at all. Down the hall, his son slept. Marcus, 7 years old, snored softly when he was deep in a good dream, which was most nights. Nathan could hear it faintly if he stood in the hallway long enough, a small, irregular sound that was somehow the most grounding thing in his world. He dressed quietly. Dark jeans, a gray Henley, boots that had seen better years, nothing that announced anything. He checked on Marcus once before leaving, cracking the door just enough to see the small lump of his son buried under a constellation print comforter, one arm dangling off the mattress, fingers loosely curled around a plastic dinosaur. Nathan stood there an extra few seconds. Then he went downstairs, nodded to the overnight security team in the lobby, and walked out into the cold. The cafe was called Birch and Grounds. It sat on the corner of Aldine Street and 9th, sandwiched between a dry cleaner that never seemed to be open and a pawn shop with a handwritten closed sign that Nathan had never once seen turned around. Birch and Grounds had warped wood floors, 7 mismatched tables, and a chalkboard menu above the counter that the owner, a 63-year-old Haitian-American woman named Claudette, updated by hand every morning in her particular looping script. Nathan had purchased it 3 years ago through a real estate holding company buried deep enough in his corporate structure that most people would need an accountant and a lawyer and a fair amount of patience to trace it back to him. He hadn't bought it as an investment. The return was negligible. He'd bought it because he'd been walking past late one night and seen Claudette through the window, alone, doing her books at the counter, and something in the way she sat, the slight hunch of someone carrying a weight they'd been carrying so long they'd stopped noticing it, had made him stop. He'd walked in and ordered a coffee at 11:30 p.m. They'd talked for almost 2 hours. By the end of the conversation, he knew 3 things: that Claudette had been running the cafe for 21 years, that she was 3 months behind on her lease, and that she would never, under any circumstances, accept charity. So he hadn't offered any. He'd bought the building instead, kept the lease reasonable, stayed out of the way. He never told her who really owned it. He came in most mornings not as an owner but as a customer, because the coffee was genuinely good, and because there was something about the place, the way it smelled, the way the light came through the windows at a particular angle just after dawn, that made him feel like a human being in a way that most of his life didn't. He noticed her on a Tuesday in late October. Or rather, he noticed her absence first, the absence of anyone else at the back table. Most mornings, that table went unused because it was drafty, and the chair closest to the wall had a leg that wobbled if you shifted your weight wrong. People sat at the counter or at the 2 tables near the front. The back table was ignored the way most inconvenient things were ignored. But that Tuesday morning, when Nathan came in and settled at his usual spot at the counter, with his coffee and the newspaper he still bought in print out of a stubbornness he couldn't fully explain, someone was at the back table. A woman. 30s, maybe? Hard to say. She had the kind of face that might have been 30 or might have been 45, depending on the day and the light and what the previous few years had done to her. Dark hair pulled back with a rubber band, a jacket that had once been olive green and was now something closer to the color of old bruises. Faded, soft at the elbows, missing the second button from the top. She wore it over a thin sweater that wasn't warm enough for October in this city. She sat with both hands wrapped around a mug of hot water. Not tea, not coffee, hot water. She was looking out the window at the street with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. Nathan watched her for a moment over the top of his newspaper, then looked away. He finished his coffee. He left. He didn't think about her again until the next morning, when she was there again. Same table, same jacket, same hands wrapped around the same mug of hot water, same stillness. By the end of that first week, Nathan had stopped pretending he wasn't paying attention. She came in every morning between 5:20 and 5:35, always before the morning rush, if you could call it that. Birch and Grounds never got crowded exactly, but there was a narrow window between 6 and 7 when the counter filled up with people on their way to somewhere else. She was always there before that. She always ordered the hot water first, and she always sat with it for exactly as long as it took for the window to start fogging at the bottom from the chill outside. Then she would reach into the pocket of that jacket, the left pocket, always, and pull out a small coin purse. Worn leather, the kind with a brass clasp that snapped. She would set it on the table and open it and look inside. Nathan wasn't close enough to see what was in it, but he was close enough to see how she looked at it. Like a woman doing math she already knew the answer to and hoping the numbers had somehow changed overnight. Most mornings she put a few coins on the table, counted them, and ordered the cheapest item on the menu. A single piece of toast, dry, for $1.25. Sometimes she added butter, sometimes she couldn't. One morning she came in and counted her coins twice and then a third time, and then she sat for a long moment with her hands flat on the table and her jaw set, and she didn't order anything at all. She just sat with the hot water until it went cold, and then she left. Nathan had watched the whole thing from the counter. He'd felt something he couldn't quite name, not pity, exactly. Something more uncomfortable than pity, something that made him feel vaguely implicated. He'd said nothing that morning, but the next morning, when she was back and going through the same ritual with the coin purse, he walked up to the counter where Claudette was wiping down the espresso machine and said quietly, "The woman at the back table. Whatever she orders, put it on my tab. Don't tell her." Claudette looked at him over the top of her reading glasses for a long moment. "She proud," Claudette said. "I know." "She find out, she gonna be upset." "Then make sure she doesn't find out." Claudette made a small sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite resistance, and went back to the espresso machine. From that morning on, whenever the woman's coins came up short, which was more often than not, Claudette simply told her that morning special was already paid for, or that the system was running a promotion, or that she'd mixed up a receipt. The woman looked skeptical every time. But she was hungry, and hunger is a more powerful argument than skepticism. Nathan never said anything about it, but he watched. Her name was Lena Carter. He learned this by accident in the second week of November, when she left a small notebook on the table and Claudette had to run after her down the block. He happened to be standing near the door when Claudette came back in, slightly breathless, and said, "That woman gonna give me a heart attack. Lena, wait, Lena," and waved the notebook over her head until the woman turned around. Lena Carter. The name fit her somehow, though he couldn't have explained why. It was a name that didn't announce itself. It was a name you might overlook. By then, they had exchanged exactly 11 words. He'd counted. He was aware that was a strange thing to count. He'd counted anyway. The 11 words were him saying good morning twice on different days and her responding both times with a small nod, and morning, said in a way that was neither warm nor cold, just honest. People said good morning as a reflex. She said morning like she'd looked at the day and made an assessment. He respected that, for reasons he didn't examine too closely. The first real conversation happened because of the rain. It was a Thursday in mid-November. He'd been in the cafe for 20 minutes already when she came through the door, and he knew immediately that something was wrong. She was soaked completely through. Not just wet, but the kind of drench that meant she'd been walking in the rain for a long time without shelter. The jacket was so wet it had darkened to almost black. Her sneakers left small puddles with each step. Her hair was plastered to the sides of her face, and she was shaking, a fine, constant tremor that she was clearly trying to control and couldn't quite manage. She made it to the back table and sat down, and he could see her press her lips together tightly, jaw working, like she was concentrating very hard on not falling apart. Claudette had appeared from the back almost immediately with a stack of clean bar towels and set them on the table without a word. Nathan had gone to the counter and asked Claudette quietly for a full breakfast, eggs, toast, coffee, orange juice, everything, to be brought to the back table. "On your tab?" Claudette asked. "Yes." "She's still going to think it's suspicious. Tell her the kitchen made extra." Claudette had given him that same look over the glasses. "You know kitchens don't work that way." "Claudette." "Fine." When the breakfast arrived at the back table, Nathan had watched from the corner of his eye as Lena looked up at the server, a college kid named Devin, who worked mornings, with an expression that was equal parts surprise and controlled suspicion. "I didn't order this," she said. "Complimentary," Devin said, which was not a word Devin normally used and which came out sounding uncertain. "For the, weather." Lena looked at the food. She looked at Devin. She looked around the cafe. Her eyes stopped briefly on Nathan. He was looking at his newspaper, or appearing to. She turned back to the food, and after a long moment she picked up the fork. She ate slowly and carefully, like someone who had learned not to take food for granted. Not fast, not desperate, deliberately. Like each bite deserved attention. Nathan drank his coffee and read the same paragraph 4 times. When he got up to leave, he passed close enough to the back table that it would have been strange not to acknowledge her. "Rough morning," he said. Not a question. She looked up at him. Up close, her eyes were a dark brown that was almost black, and they were sharper than he'd expected. Alert, watchful. The eyes of someone who had learned to read situations quickly. "Something like that," she said. "The coffee here's good," he said, which was a genuinely stupid thing to say given that she was sitting right there with a cup of it, and he was aware of that as he said it. Something moved across her face. Not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one. "Yeah," she said. "It is." He nodded once and left. He sat in the back of his car for a moment before telling the driver to go anywhere, just drive. And he thought about the way she'd held the fork, like it was something worth holding carefully. December came in cold and gray, the kind of cold that settled into the concrete and didn't lift until April. The conversation started slowly. That was the right word for it. Slowly. Not tentatively, not carefully, just slowly, the way you move when you're not rushing toward anything and you're not sure you should. He learned things in small installments. She'd grown up in the city, East Side, near the old textile district. Her mother had worked 2 jobs for most of her childhood. Her father had been around in the physical sense and absent in every other. She'd done well enough in school, had gone to community college for 2 years before money ran out, and had spent her 20s working a series of jobs that never quite added up to stability. Administrative assistant, then retail manager, then a brief and apparently exhausting stint at a nonprofit that she described only as not what the brochure promised. She talked about these things the way you talk about weather that's already passed. Informative, not particularly sentimental. What she didn't talk about, he noticed, was the present. She talked around it. When he asked how she was doing, she'd redirect, ask about Marcus, whose existence she knew about because Nathan had mentioned him once and then couldn't seem to stop mentioning him, apparently. She asked about the city, about the neighborhood, about the dry cleaner next door that was always closed. 22 months, Nathan told her. "I've counted." She'd laughed at that. A real laugh, short and surprised, and it had changed her face completely. Made her look younger and tired in a different way, a softer way. What he noticed more than anything was that she never asked him for anything, not once. Not even the small asks that most people made without thinking. She never said, "Could you hand me that?" or "Do you have $1?" or "Can I borrow your phone?" She was careful about it in a way that seemed entirely unconscious. The carefulness of someone who had trained herself out of needing things from people because needing things from people had cost her something she couldn't get back. He didn't push it. He brought it up once with his assistant, Priya, not as a request but as a passing mention, and Priya, who was 30 years old and had a master's degree in organizational psychology and an almost supernatural ability to identify what was actually being said underneath what was literally being said, had looked at him over her laptop and said, "Are you telling me about this woman because you want me to do something or because you don't know what to do and you need to say it out loud?" The second one, he'd said, which was the most honest answer he'd given anyone in months. One morning in late December, she asked him something that stopped him mid-sip. They were sitting across from each other. This had become normal, somehow, over the previous weeks. The two of them at the back table, coffee between them, the cafe humming quietly around them. It was still early enough that the other tables were mostly empty. "If you didn't have any of it," she said, "the money, the company, the buildings, all of it, what would you actually want to do?" He looked at her. "Not what would you do to survive," she continued. "What would you want? If those were two different things." He put his cup down. He thought about it, actually thought about it, which was not something he was asked to do often in his professional life, where the questions people posed to him already had expected answers embedded in them. "There's this restaurant idea I've had since I was maybe 23, he said, finally. "Stupid, probably. Tell me. Place where people eat well regardless of what they can pay. Not a soup kitchen, not charity. A real restaurant. Good food. Nice enough space. But there's a wall. Customers who can afford it pay a little extra, and that covers meals for whoever comes in and can't. No announcement, no vouchers. Nobody has to explain themselves or fill out paperwork or look humiliated. They just eat." He'd said it quickly, the way you say things you've kept a long time, rushed, a little apologetic. Lena was quiet for a moment. "What's the wall look like?" she asked. He blinked. "What?" "The wall, where they post the paid meals. What does it look like?" Nobody had ever asked him that. He had a full picture of this restaurant in his head, the kind of detailed, persistent image that shows up in the mind of someone who has thought about something for nearly a decade, and he realized he'd never described it to anyone before. "Corkboard," he said. "Big one. Different colored cards for different meals. Something handmade looking, not fancy. Shouldn't look institutional." She nodded slowly. "And people just come in and take a card off the wall?" "Take a card, give it to the server, that's it. No questions." No questions. She turned and looked out the window for a moment. When she looked back, her expression had shifted in a way he couldn't quite read. It was the look of someone who has just recognized something they weren't expecting to find. "That's a good idea," she said. "It's been a good idea for 9 years, and I haven't done anything about it." "Maybe you weren't ready 9 years ago." He looked at her. "That sounds like something a person says when they're being polite." The ghost of a smile appeared again. "I'm not very polite," she said. "Ask Claudette." From behind the counter, without looking up, Claudette called, "That's the God's honest truth." Nathan laughed. It surprised him. The ease of it, the way it came out without effort, which was rarer than it should have been. She stopped coming in the first week of January. He noticed on the third morning. Not on the first. He'd told himself she was probably just late or had other things to do, which was reasonable and normal and none of his business. Not on the second. He'd told himself the same thing more firmly, which was a sign that he was starting to lose the argument. By the third morning, he sat at the back table instead of the counter and drank his coffee and stared at the door and admitted, quietly and only to himself, that he was worried. He didn't have her number. He didn't have an address. He didn't even know her last name at first, though he'd since confirmed it, Carter. He knew she lived somewhere on the east side based on a comment she'd made once about the bus lines. He knew she had no one she called in emergencies based on the fact that she'd once mentioned having to navigate a medical appointment entirely alone, said in the offhand tone of someone describing a minor inconvenience rather than a fact about their life that was quietly devastating. He thought about asking Claudette if she knew anything. Claudette knew things. Claudette had been running this cafe for 21 years and had developed the particular intelligence of someone who pays attention to people in the early morning before their defenses are fully up. But before he could bring it up, Claudette appeared at the back table with a coffee refill he hadn't asked for and set it down and said, without preamble, "She hasn't been in." I know. You worried? He picked up the cup. I don't know her well enough to... Nathan. Claudette said his name with the particular weight of someone who had known him longer than he'd been rich. She'd been one of the first people he'd come back to see when things changed, partly because he wanted to help, and partly because she was someone who would tell him the truth about himself without ceremony. You've been sitting at that table for 6 weeks because she sits there. Don't dress it up. He said nothing. I don't have any way to reach her either, Claudette said. So there's nothing to be done but wait. He had resources, of course. Resources that could locate a person in the city, investigators, contacts in municipal databases, people who owed him favors and positions that gave them access to information. He thought about using them. He didn't. It felt wrong in a way he couldn't fully articulate but trusted completely. She was a woman who guarded her privacy carefully, who had never given him more than she chose to give. Using money and influence to find her would have been a violation of the only thing he actually understood about her. So he waited. And while he waited, he did something he hadn't expected. He went back to the restaurant idea, pulled it up in his mind like a file he'd left in a drawer, thought about it with more attention than he'd given it in years, started making notes on his phone, then in a dedicated notebook he bought specifically for the purpose, a plain one, black cover, nothing written on the front. He wrote down the wall, the corkboard, the colored cards. He wrote down the menu. Simple food, done well, bread made fresh, soup that actually took time, the kind of cooking that required you to respect the ingredients. He wrote down what it shouldn't be. He was very clear about what it shouldn't be. He didn't examine too closely why he was doing this now, with any particular urgency. He just did it. The way you do things when you're waiting for something, and the waiting is difficult and you need something that feels like forward motion. Lena came back on a Thursday, 18 days after she'd disappeared. He was at the counter when she walked through the door, and he was careful not to stand up too fast or show too much in his face, because he suspected she would not like it if she thought he'd been watching for her. So he stayed on his stool and lifted his coffee cup and said calmly, "Hey." "Hey," she said. She walked to the back table. She moved differently than he remembered, or maybe he was looking more carefully, looking for what he'd missed before. She was thinner, definitively. The jacket sat differently on her shoulders, a small amount of space where there hadn't been before. She sat down more slowly, the deliberate, careful movement of someone managing pain they'd rather not draw attention to. She ordered the toast. Devin brought it. She ate. Nathan finished his coffee, paid his tab, and carried his cup to the back table without asking if it was all right. He set it down across from her and sat. She looked at him. "You gonna ask?" "No." A pause. "Why not?" "Because if you wanted to tell me, you would have." Something in her expression shifted, a slight relaxation around the eyes, as if she'd been bracing for something and hadn't needed to. "Most people ask," she said. "Most people ask because it makes them feel better," he said. "It's got nothing to do with you." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her toast and took a bite and looked out the window. "I was sick," she said finally. "Just that." "Okay," he said. She nodded. They sat in silence for a while, which didn't feel like silence anymore, but something more comfortable. The cafe around them filled in gradually with the early morning crowd. The commuters, the regulars, the man who always ordered 2 large coffees and never seemed to drink either of them. The light changed as the sun came up somewhere behind the clouds, gray brightening to pale gray. "The restaurant," Lena said eventually. "The one with the wall." "Yeah? You should do it." She said it plainly, not as encouragement, more like a statement of fact she'd arrived at and was reporting. People need that more than they need another tower with someone's name on it. He looked at her. "Most people in my position would tell me to build the tower." "Yeah, well," she picked up her coffee. "Good thing I'm not most people." January hardened into February, and the city got meaner in the cold, the way cities do, shorter with each other, heads down, everyone moving faster and looking at less. But inside Birch and Grounds, the mornings stayed the same, which was a thing Nathan had started to rely on more than he would have admitted. He and Lena didn't talk every morning. Some mornings she came in, and he was there, but they just coexisted, 2 people at their respective tables reading or thinking or staring at the street outside. Those mornings had their own particular quality that he found, unexpectedly, restful. He spent most of his working life performing certainty, performing authority, performing the particular kind of relaxed confidence that powerful people were expected to project at all times. The cafe in the early morning was the one place where he didn't have to perform anything. He told her about Marcus one morning when his son had had a nightmare the previous night, and climbed into Nathan's bed at 2 a.m. and spent the remaining hours taking up 90% of the mattress. "He's 7, and he sleeps like he's trying to cover the whole country," Nathan said. Lena laughed. "What was the nightmare about?" "A dinosaur that could also do math. That is terrifying." "Right? Math is bad enough without teeth." She asked about Marcus with genuine curiosity, not the polished, appropriate-sounding interest of someone performing interest, but real questions. What did he like? What was he scared of? What made him laugh? Nathan found himself talking about his son for long stretches, which he rarely did with other adults. Not because he wasn't proud, but because he was aware that talking about your child to people without children required a kind of translation he usually didn't bother attempting. Lena didn't need the translation. She just listened and asked follow-up questions and occasionally said things that were quietly perceptive, the kind of observations that told him she'd thought carefully about what he'd said. "He sounds like someone who notices things," she said once, after he'd described Marcus's habit of cataloging things, types of clouds, species of birds he spotted from the window, makes of old cars. "That's not something you can teach." "No," Nathan said. "I don't know where he gets it." Lena gave him a look that said something. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said, but she was almost smiling. He understood what she meant by it and felt, briefly and uncomplicatedly, pleased. She disappeared again in early March, this time for 9 days. He handled it worse. He knew he was handling it worse and was irritated with himself about it. He sat at the back table each morning and drank his coffee and felt the empty chair across from him with a specificity that was disproportionate and impossible to argue himself out of. He called Priya one afternoon and said, without introduction, "I think I've gotten too attached to a friendship." There was a pause. "The woman from the cafe?" Priya said. He'd mentioned Lena enough times in passing that Priya had clearly filed her away somewhere accessible. "I don't know anything about her life," he said. "She disappears for days and I have no way to know if she's all right." "But you want to." "That's the problem, yes." "Is it a problem because you're worried about her or because you can't do anything about it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Is there a difference?" "For you?" "Definitely." He thought about that. Nathan Mercer had grown up poor and become rich, and the transition had given him, among other things, the complicated psychology of someone who could fix almost anything and had built an identity partly around the fixing. The inability to do something was not a state he sat in comfortably. "I think she's sick," he said. "I think it's more serious than she lets on." "Have you asked?" "She doesn't want to be asked." "Then what are you going to do?" "I don't know," he said, which was true, and which he said out loud rarely enough that it landed strangely in the air. "Nathan," Priya said, "just be her friend. Sometimes that's actually the thing." She came back in the second week of March. She was wearing a new jacket. Not new, different. Slightly better than the old one, gray wool, still clearly secondhand, but warmer. She'd tied her hair back with an actual elastic instead of a rubber band. She looked, paradoxically, both worse and more composed. Thinner than ever, with a grayish undertone to her complexion that wasn't there before, but sitting straight-backed and deliberate in the way of someone who has made a private decision. She sat at the back table. He brought his coffee over without ceremony and sat across from her. "You look terrible," he said. Not unkindly. "Thank you," she said. "So do you." He didn't look terrible, but he appreciated the response. "Lena," he started. "Don't." "I wasn't going to ask." "Then what were you going to do?" He hadn't decided. He picked up his cup. "Tell you something," he said. "What?" "I bought a building 2 weeks ago. An old restaurant space on Meridian. Been empty for 4 years. Good bones." He paused. "I'm going to do it. The restaurant." She looked at him. "The wall," he said. "The corkboard. No questions, no paperwork, just people eating. He set his cup down. I thought you should know. She was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that he started wondering if he'd said the wrong thing, struck a tone that was off somewhere. Why are you telling me? She asked. Her voice was a fraction lower than usual. Because you're the only person who's ever asked what the wall looked like, he said. She looked down at the table. Her hands were wrapped around her mug in the old way. The very first way he'd ever seen her, the cup of hot water, the contained stillness. Then she looked up. Don't make it perfect, she said. People don't trust perfect things. What do you mean? The restaurant. Make it a little imperfect, a little worn in, so people feel like they belong there. She paused. Perfect spaces tell people they shouldn't be there. They can feel it. He thought about that. He'd been thinking about the restaurant in terms of quality, good materials, done right. He hadn't thought about whether it should carry the particular warmth of something lived in. How do you know that? He asked. Her expression was careful. Because I've been told I don't belong in places, she said, and I've been in places where nobody had to say it. He held that for a moment. I understand, he said. She picked up her toast. They sat in the quiet, and outside the window the city moved through its morning, and inside the cafe something settled between them. Not a resolution, not a conclusion, but the particular kind of ease that comes when two people stop performing for each other and just exist in the same room. Nathan Mercer looked across the table at Lena Carter and understood something he wouldn't find the right words for until much later. That she was teaching him something, and that she'd been teaching him from the beginning, and that he had not yet learned enough. He didn't know how little time there was left. He ordered another coffee. She ordered another piece of toast, with butter this time. Claudette brought it without being asked, and the morning light came through the window at that particular angle that made everything inside the cafe look a little golden and a little fragile, and entirely worth holding on to. The building on Meridian Street had been a Greek restaurant once, back when that part of the city still had foot traffic on weekend evenings, and people made reservations 3 weeks out. Nathan knew this because the previous owner, a man in his 70s named Demetrios, who now lived in Florida and sounded tired when they spoke on the phone, had told him so, unprompted, in the kind of detail that meant he missed it. Best spanakopita in the state, Demetrios had said. Nobody cared. Nathan had bought the building for a number below what it was worth, which made him feel vaguely guilty, and then reminded himself that the building had been sitting empty for 4 years accumulating damage and back taxes, and that guilt was probably misplaced. He stood inside it on a Saturday morning in late March, a week after his last conversation with Lena, and looked at the space. It was rough. The ceiling had a water stain in the corner near the kitchen entrance that had the shape and size of something you should take seriously. Several floor tiles were cracked, 2 were missing entirely, and the light fixture above what had been the main dining room was a hanging ruin of brass and frosted glass that had clearly given up trying to be beautiful. The kitchen was better. Solid commercial equipment, most of it salvageable. But the ventilation hood had been improperly installed at some point in the past decade and would need to come out completely. His contractor, a compact and permanently skeptical man named Ray Solis, stood beside him making marks on a clipboard and occasionally making a small sound that communicated disapproval without committing to specifics. 4 months minimum, Ray said. If nothing's wrong with the plumbing. Is something wrong with the plumbing? Ray made the sound again. Budget it as if something's wrong with the plumbing, Nathan said. Already did. Nathan walked to the far end of the dining room and stood where the back wall was. Big wall. 12 feet wide at least, and the plaster was in reasonable shape, yet no major cracks, no visible moisture damage. He stood in front of it for a moment. This wall stays, he said. Ray looked up from the clipboard. Structural? No, I just want it. Ray wrote something down. He had long since stopped asking Nathan to explain his decisions, which was one of the reasons Nathan kept hiring him. The space was not beautiful. It was exactly what it was. A thing that had been left alone too long and needed serious attention before it could become anything. But standing in it, Nathan felt something he hadn't felt in the planning stages of any project in recent memory. He felt like it was worth the trouble, which was different from feeling like it would succeed. He'd had plenty of things succeed that weren't worth the trouble. He took out his phone and took a photograph of the back wall. That evening, sitting at the kitchen counter while Marcus worked through a spelling assignment at the table behind him, Nathan looked at the photograph for a long time. He thought about what Lena had said. Make it imperfect. Make it worn in. So people feel like they belong there. He wrote that down in the black notebook. Not as a quote attributed to her, just as a fact about what the place should feel like. He was getting better at the difference between an instruction and a truth. This was both. Marcus appeared at his elbow without warning, the way 7-year-olds did, materializing silently and then being very much present. He looked at Nathan's phone screen. What's that? A building I'm working on. It looks dirty. It is. I'm going to fix it. Marcus considered this. Into what? A restaurant. What kind? Nathan thought about how to explain the concept to a 7-year-old without making it sound like a civics lesson. The kind where you can eat even if you forgot your wallet, he said. Marcus looked at him seriously. That could happen to anyone. Exactly, Nathan said. Marcus went back to his spelling. Nathan looked at the photograph a little longer, then put his phone down and started making dinner. He burned the onions slightly, which was not unusual, and Marcus told him they tasted smoky in a tone that suggested this was a negative. And Nathan said that was called flavor. And Marcus said that was called a mistake. And Nathan laughed and started over, and the evening moved forward the way evenings did in that apartment when they were both home. Imperfectly, easily, with the comfortable friction of two people who genuinely liked each other even when one of them was 7 and the other one was tired. He thought about Lena, briefly, before he fell asleep. About the gray in her complexion that morning, about the way she'd sat straight-backed and deliberate, about the decision in her eyes that he hadn't asked about and that hadn't stopped sitting at the back of his mind since. He thought, she is dealing with something she has decided to deal with alone. He thought, there is nothing I can do about that. He turned over and stared at the ceiling for a while and then eventually slept. The alarm went off at 4:47. He got up. He went to the cafe. She was there. And that, for the morning, was enough. April brought in consistency. She came 3 days in a row, then missed 4, then came back on a Wednesday looking like she'd slept badly for an extended period. Not just last night, but many nights stacked behind it. She had started ordering actual coffee by then, which Claudette had started bringing without being asked, and which Nathan had long since added to his silent arrangement with the counter staff. Lena never mentioned the coffee appearing. He never mentioned paying for it. It had become one of the quiet understandings of their mornings together, unacknowledged in the way that the most functional arrangements often were. She was different in April. Not dramatically. She was too controlled for drama, and he'd come to understand that about her, that whatever was happening to her physically was being managed behind a very deliberate presentation. But there were small things. She held her coffee cup more tightly than she used to, both hands wrapped all the way around it rather than loosely cradling it. She was sometimes somewhere else for a few seconds mid-conversation, not distracted exactly, more like briefly navigating something internal and then coming back. She apologized for it once, and he told her not to, and the subject was dropped. What she hadn't changed was the way she asked him questions. That was consistent every morning. She asked about the restaurant, specific questions, not general encouragement. What was the kitchen layout going to be? Had he figured out the supply chain for fresh bread? Was he going to do breakfast or just lunch and dinner? And if lunch, what was the plan for the in-between hours when places like this tended to drift into dead time? She'd clearly thought about it between visits, which meant she'd been thinking about it on the days she wasn't there, which meant she thought about their conversations when she was away. And that meant something to him that he didn't put a name on. "You've worked in restaurants," he said one morning in mid-April. She looked up from her cup. "What makes you say that?" "The questions you ask. They're operational, not conceptual." She considered this for a moment, which was her version of deciding whether to confirm or deflect. "I managed a catering operation for about 2 years," she said, "for a nonprofit that did event fundraising." "The brochure one?" "Yeah." A pause. "It was actually fine, the work. It was the people above me." She said this with a flatness that contained a lot she wasn't expanding on. "What happened?" "Budget cuts," she said. "Or I was told it was budget cuts." She looked out the window. I was the newest person in the position, and I had the least amount of whatever it is that makes people keep you around when the numbers get tight. That's not always about competence, Nathan said. I know that now. She said it without bitterness, which was its own kind of bitter. I knew it then too, knowing it doesn't help much. He'd been in enough situations, before the money and after it, to understand what she meant. There was a particular kind of knowledge that was functionally useless. The knowledge that something unfair had happened to you, which changed nothing about the fact that it had happened. He'd watched people spend years getting very eloquent about injustices that had nonetheless destroyed them, and eloquence didn't rebuild what got torn down. What did you do after that? He asked. She shrugged. Piece things together, freelance this, gig that, the usual. She wrapped both hands around her cup again. It works until it doesn't. When did it stop working? She looked at him. You said you weren't going to ask. I'm not asking about that, he said carefully. I'm asking about the work. She held his gaze for a moment, weighing something. About 18 months ago, she said. He did the math without making it visible on his face. 18 months ago she'd been, what, stable enough maybe, and then not. One thing going wrong leading to another the way they did, the particular cascade of misfortune that didn't look dramatic from the outside because it happened gradually, and then all at once. And by the time it was visible to anyone who might have helped, the person it was happening to had usually been managing the impossible for a long time already. Okay, he said. She blinked. Okay? You answered the question. That's enough. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Most people want the whole story. Most people want to be able to categorize you, he said. Figure out whether you're a cautionary tale or an inspiration. Makes them more comfortable. Something flickered across her face. And you? I already know you're a person, he said. That's more information than most people start with. She looked down at her cup. He couldn't read her expression from that angle, just the line of her jaw, which was tight and then released. When she looked up, something had shifted in her eyes. Not dramatically, just slightly open in a way it hadn't been a moment before. The catering job, she said, before it ended. We did this fundraiser for a family shelter downtown. Buffet dinner, 200 guests, the works. And there was this one family, mother, 2 kids, maybe 5 and 8, who'd been placed in transitional housing. They came in for dinner, and the mother spent the whole time cutting food into pieces for the little one and making sure the older one had enough and ate almost nothing herself. She paused. After they left, I found out she'd told the organizer she wasn't hungry. She'd said it twice. Lena set her cup down. She wasn't not hungry. She was making sure there was enough. Nathan said nothing. There was nothing useful to say. I thought about her for weeks after, Lena said. I don't know why I'm telling you that. I think you are telling me that for a reason, he said. I'm just not going to say what it is. She looked at him with an expression that was hard to read and held it for a moment. You're strange, she said. Not unkindly. I've been told. I mean it as a compliment. I know. The cafe filled in around them, the morning crowd trickling through, and they sat in the particular way they'd developed over months of mornings. Not performing conversation, not filling silence out of discomfort, just occupying the same space with the same purpose, which was something Nathan had come to value more than he had words for. He thought about the mother at the fundraiser. He thought about the wall in the restaurant. He thought about Lena sitting here in October with a cup of hot water and a coin purse, and a stillness that had looked like resignation, but turned out to be something else entirely. He thought about how you couldn't always tell the difference from the outside. He opened his notebook. He'd taken to bringing it to the cafe, and wrote something down. Lena glanced at the notebook. You bring that everywhere now, she said. Restaurant notes. Can I see? He hesitated for half a second, not because it was private exactly, but because he'd never shown it to anyone, and it felt like showing someone a room in your house that you'd been using as a place to think out loud. Then he slid it across the table. She turned pages slowly. He watched her read. She didn't make sounds while she read, didn't say or oh, interesting, the way people sometimes did when they were performing engagement. She just read. Occasionally she slowed on a page. Once she went back 2 pages and reread something. After a few minutes, she closed the notebook and slid it back. "The seating layout," she said. "The way you've got the back section, are you keeping that separated from the rest?" "I was thinking distinct, not separated. Same sight lines. Don't separate it. People who come in on the wall cards will know if they're being sat in a different section. Even if nothing's said, they'll know." She said this with the certainty of someone reporting a fact they'd personally confirmed. "Keep it all one room." "Okay," he said. "And the menu board. You were going to do digital?" "I was considering it." "Don't. Handwritten. Something close to what Claudette does. It makes the place feel temporary in the right way. Like someone's here, right now, making decisions." From behind the counter, Claudette appeared as if summoned. "Someone said my name?" "Nobody said your name," Lena said. "I thought I heard flattery." "You heard handwritten menu board." Claudette looked at the two of them. She'd been watching them for months with the particular expression of someone who understood more than was being said and was keeping it to herself for reasons she considered good. "You want more coffee?" she said. "Yes," they both said, at the same time. Claudette picked up both cups. She walked back to the counter without comment, but Nathan could see from the side that she was smiling. May arrived with the kind of weather the city occasionally produced as an apology for the winter. 3 weeks of clean air and tolerable temperatures and light that came in sideways and made the streets look like somewhere else, somewhere you might choose. Nathan was deep in the restaurant renovation by then, spending 4 or 5 hours most days on Meridian, watching Ray Solis move through the space with his clipboard and his skeptical silences. The water damage in the ceiling corner had turned out to be worse than it looked, which Ray communicated with the particular satisfaction of a man who had predicted exactly this. The kitchen ventilation came out and turned out to have been installed over a pre-existing installation that nobody had fully removed, which was genuinely baffling and cost 2 weeks of additional work. Nathan spent more time on the project than any of his advisors thought was warranted given its scale. He was aware of this. He was also aware that the scale wasn't the point. His CFO, a precise man named Garrett, who communicated primarily through carefully worded concern, had asked him once what the projected return on Meridian was, and Nathan had said something I can't put in a column, and Garrett had written something down and not asked again. He told Lena about the ventilation problem one morning. She laughed. A real one. The kind that still surprised him a little with how much it changed her face. Installed over the old one? As if they just pretended the old one wasn't there. "That's very human," she said. "Expensive is what it is." "Most human things are." She was quiet for a moment, in the brief way she sometimes went quiet, navigating something, coming back. "How's Ray?" He'd mentioned Ray enough times that she'd started asking about him by name, which meant she was tracking the cast of his project the way you track the characters of a story you were invested in. That realization had arrived a few mornings ago and sat with Nathan in a particular way. She cared about how this went. She was paying attention to it with a consistency that told him it mattered to her in some way she hadn't explained. "Ray is skeptical as ever," Nathan said, "which means things are going fine. A skeptical contractor is a good contractor." "That's what he says." "Smart man." She picked up her coffee. The morning light was doing its May thing with the windows, and in it Lena looked. He searched for the right word and landed on present. Not better, not worse. Present in the specific way of someone who had decided to be where they were and mean it. She'd been coming in more regularly in May. 4 mornings out of 5, sometimes 5 for 5. He didn't remark on it, she didn't explain it, but there was something different about the way she moved through the mornings now. A carefulness that was specific rather than general, like she was measuring out something finite and making sure none of it was wasted. He didn't put words to that observation either. He was getting better at sitting with things he understood, but didn't need to say out loud. One morning in the 3rd week of May, she asked about Marcus. This wasn't unusual. She asked about Marcus regularly, always with the same specific curiosity, wanting to know the real details rather than the highlight reel. But this morning she asked something she hadn't asked before. "Does he know about his mother?" Nathan set his cup down. "What has he been told, or what does he actually understand?" "Both." He was quiet for a moment. This was not a topic he opened casually. His ex-wife Claire had left when Marcus was 14 months old, not in a catastrophic way, not with drama or ultimatums, but in the way of someone who had discovered that the life they were in was not the life they were capable of living. She wasn't a villain in the story. She was a woman who had found out too late that she wasn't built for certain things, and who had made an honest choice that was also an irreversible one. She sent birthday cards. She had a phone arrangement with Nathan that she used intermittently. Marcus knew he had a mother somewhere. He had stopped asking about her with any regularity around age 5, which Nathan considered either a sign of acceptance or a sign of compartmentalization, and sometimes couldn't tell the difference. "He knows the basic shape of it," Nathan said. "That she and I weren't going to work, that she lives somewhere else, that it doesn't mean anything about him." He paused. Whether he believes that last part, I genuinely don't know. Lena turned her cup in her hands. "He will," she said. "Eventually. Kids mostly figure out that the things their parents do aren't about them. It takes a while." "Did you figure that out?" "Yeah." She looked at the table. "Eventually," she said. "It took longer than it should have." She said this without invitation for follow-up, and he didn't follow up. But he filed it away. Another small piece of the picture she'd allowed him to see, offered not as confession but as simple fact, the way she offered almost everything. What he noticed over all these months was that she never complained. This sounds simple and is not. Nathan had spent years surrounded by people who complained with sophistication, not about small things, but about their circumstances, the unfairness of their position relative to what they deserved, the gap between what they had and what was owed to them. He'd done his share of it too, in the early years. There was something almost comforting in complaint, in the act of identifying what was wrong and saying it out loud. It felt like evidence of self-awareness. Lena didn't do that. She described her life with the specificity of a witness. Accurate, unembellished, no editorializing about what it meant or who was to blame. She had not called herself unlucky. She had not called herself a victim. She had not characterized what had happened to her as unfair, even in moments when it self-evidently was. She just described what was, and then moved on to the next thing. He'd asked her once, early on in their mornings together, too early, probably, whether she was angry about any of it. She'd thought about the question with more seriousness than he'd expected. "I was for a long time," she said. "It didn't do anything." "Did it help, even temporarily?" "For about 10 minutes, then I was just angry and still in the same situation." "So you decided not to be angry?" "I decided it was expensive," she said, "and I was already running low." He thought about that answer for weeks. He still thought about it. It was the answer of someone who had run the calculation with perfect honesty and arrived at a conclusion that cost them something and paid it anyway. The restaurant on Meridian was starting to look like something by early June. The ceiling corner was repaired. The floor tiles were replaced with materials that matched almost perfectly. Ray had found a salvage supplier who had the same line from the same decade, which Ray had reported as a minor miracle in the tone of a man who didn't believe in miracles. The back wall had been replastered and painted a warm off-white that in certain lights looked close to cream. The corkboard Nathan had described, the big one, handmade-looking, practical, not decorative, was custom-built by a carpenter named Sasha who'd worked on 3 other projects of Nathan's and who had listened to the description with her head tilted and then said, "I know exactly what you mean," and turned out to be completely right. He'd stood in front of it one afternoon, the empty board in the otherwise quiet space, and felt something that was too complicated to be called pride. It was more like recognition. This thing I imagined is now a real thing in the world. He took a photograph and brought it to the cafe the next morning. He slid his phone across the table to Lena. She looked at it for a long time. He watched her. The light was coming through the window at 7 a.m. Angle, which was good light, honest light, and in it he could see things in her face that he usually had to read more carefully. The gray in her complexion was more pronounced than last week. The bones of her face were slightly more present beneath the skin. She was losing weight in a way that wasn't the weight of someone who wasn't eating well. He made sure she was eating well, as much as he could, within the limits of what she'd accept. This was something else. This was weight leaving from somewhere deeper, but her eyes, looking at the photograph, were bright. The wall, she said. Yeah, it looks like what you described. That was the goal. She kept looking at it. He didn't take the phone back. He let her look as long as she wanted. The cards, she said. What color are the cards going to be? Warm colors, yellows, oranges. Claudette's idea. Lena looked up. Claudette knows about this? She's going to supply the bread. He paused. She also said she might retrain her nephew to run the morning service there so she can scale back here. She didn't say that was related to her knees, but Lena smiled. A full one, not the ghost. She's been standing on those floors for 20 years. 21. She handed his phone back. You should open it before winter, she said. That's the plan. October, if Ray doesn't find any more ghosts in the walls. What would you name it? He'd been turning this over for months. He had a list in the black notebook. 9 names, all of them wrong in different ways. Too precious. Too on the nose. Too much like the name of a place that was trying to tell you how to feel about it. I don't know yet, he said. She nodded. She didn't offer anything, which meant she was thinking, and when she thought about something, she came back to it eventually. He'd learned to wait. She didn't come back to it that morning. She finished her coffee, gathered herself with the deliberate care that had become characteristic of her movement in recent weeks, and stood up from the back table. She picked up her jacket, still the gray wool one from March, worn soft by now at the elbows, and put it on. She straightened it. Good morning, Nathan, she said. Good morning, Lena. She walked out, and through the window he watched her move down the sidewalk, straight-backed, careful, deliberate. The Maylight was good. She walked until she was out of sight, and then she was gone, and the morning continued on without her the way mornings did. He sat for a while longer, one hand on his coffee cup. Claudette appeared from behind the counter and sat in the chair Lena had vacated, which she had never once done before in all the time Nathan had been coming in. She put her elbows on the table and looked at him directly. He looked back. She's sick, Claudette said. Not the kind you get better from. The words sat in the air between them. He'd known this, in the way you know something when you've been paying very careful attention and have assembled enough small pieces into a picture you don't want to look at directly. She hasn't said it, he said. No, Claudette said. She won't. How do you know? Because she came in one morning in February while you were running late. And she sat at this table alone for 45 minutes, and I sat with her for 20 of those, and she talked about you. Claudette said this plainly, without drama. Not about what was happening to her, about what she thought about you, what she thought you were going to become. She paused. And about the restaurant. Nathan was quiet. She said, Claudette continued, that it was the first time in a long time she'd had something she was looking forward to seeing finished. The cafe was filling up around them. Someone came through the door with a cold blast of morning air. The espresso machine started up behind the counter where Devin had taken over. The city was moving through its ordinary morning the way it always did, indifferent and ongoing. Nathan kept his hand on his coffee cup and looked at the table and didn't say anything. Claudette stood up. She picked up both their cups. She went back to the counter. He sat at the back table by the window for a long time after that. Long past when he should have left. Long past when his phone started accumulating messages he'd need to answer. Long past when the morning rush peaked and thinned and the cafe settled into the mid-morning quiet. He sat and he thought about looking forward to something, about what it meant to have something you wanted to see finished, about what it cost to carry that forward when the time you had was not something anyone could negotiate. Outside, the city moved on, ordinary, indifferent, entirely unaware. He finally stood up. He buttoned his jacket. He picked up the black notebook from the table and held it for a moment, thinking about the wall on Meridian, the corkboard, the colored cards. He walked to the counter. Claudette, he said. She looked up. If she tells you anything she needs. Claudette looked at him over the reading glasses. She won't ask, she said. I know. If she does. A pause. Claudette nodded once. The kind of nod that was an agreement and also something else. Something that understood what was being asked underneath what was literally being said. He walked out into the June morning, and the door closed behind him, and the small bell above it rang once, and then was still. She stopped coming in on a Tuesday in the second week of June. Nathan noticed on Wednesday, which meant he'd already spent one morning not registering her absence as anything other than ordinary. She'd missed mornings before. She'd come back before. The pattern had repeated enough times that he'd trained himself out of immediate alarm. But on Wednesday, he sat at the back table and felt the particular quality of the empty chair across from him. And something in the quality was different this time. He couldn't have explained the difference if pressed. He just felt it, the way you feel a change in air pressure before weather arrives. Thursday, she wasn't there. Friday, she wasn't there. He sat at the counter on Friday instead of the back table, which was a small, irrational act of self-protection he recognized for what it was and performed anyway. Claudette said nothing. She brought his coffee and went back to the counter, and they both understood that there was nothing useful to say, and said none of it. By the following Monday, Nathan had stopped pretending he wasn't watching the door. He sat at the counter and drank his coffee and kept his eyes on the entrance with the focused attention of someone doing something that felt like holding a structure up by sheer concentration, which he knew was irrational and did anyway. She didn't come. He started the week at full capacity externally. Meetings, calls, a site visit to Meridian where Ray showed him the new kitchen layout and the repaired ceiling and the installed ventilation hood, and used the word acceptable, which from Ray was indistinguishable from a standing ovation. Nathan walked through the space and nodded at the right moments, and asked the right questions, and noted the progress in the black notebook, and drove back to the office in the town car, and sat in the back seat for the full 20 minutes of the ride without looking at anything. Priya had left 3 items on his desk requiring decisions. He made the decisions in approximately 8 minutes, which she noted with the particular expression she wore when she was either impressed or concerned, and you couldn't tell which. "You okay?" she asked. "Working on something," he said, which was true in a technical sense. "The restaurant or the other thing?" He looked up. "You've mentioned her less this month," Priya said carefully, which usually means something's either resolved or it's gotten harder. He looked at her for a moment. Priya was good at people in the way of someone who had paid close attention to them for a long time and had never stopped. It was what made her exceptional at her job and occasionally uncomfortable to be around when you were carrying something you hadn't sorted out yet. "I don't know where she is," he said. "She's been out for over a week. I have no way to reach her." Priya was quiet. "Is there anything I can do?" He'd thought about this. He'd thought about it the same way he'd thought about it in January, when Lena had first disappeared for 18 days and arrived at the same conclusion. "No," he said, "there isn't." He said it without resentment, which was harder than it sounded. The second week passed. He went to the cafe every morning and sat at the counter and drank his coffee and looked at the back table and the empty chair and the window behind it, through which the June streets were warm and bright and indifferent. He started going to Meridian in the evenings instead of his usual daytime visits. Something about the space in the evening, after Ray and the crew had left, when it was just the building settling and the street noise coming through the walls, felt more honest than it did during the day. He would walk through the dining room with his hands in his pockets and stand at different points and try to feel what the place would feel like when it was full. He stood in front of the cork board one evening and stayed there for a long time. The board was finished. Sasha had done exactly what he'd described, and it was exactly right, large and practical and handmade looking without being precious. It was mounted at a height anyone could reach. He'd imagined cards on it. The warm-colored cards, yellows and oranges, Claudette's suggestion, that would represent prepaid meals. He thought about Lena asking what color the cards were going to be. He thought about her looking at the photograph of the empty board and saying, simply, "the wall." He took out his phone and tried once more to find contact information for Alina Carter in the city. He found 7 women with variations of that name in various databases his assistant had access to for legitimate business purposes. He looked at each profile. None of them matched. Either the information wasn't current, or she was living in a way that didn't generate much of a digital footprint, which, given everything he knew about her situation, was entirely possible. He put his phone away. He stood in the empty restaurant on Meridian Street in the June evening, and for the first time in a long time, felt the particular helplessness of having every resource and the wrong problem. The third week. He was at the cafe at 5:30 on a Monday morning, which was earlier than usual. He hadn't slept well. He'd been up at 4:15 and had spent a restless hour in the kitchen drinking water and looking at the city lights through the window before giving up and getting dressed. Marcus had his own alarm now, a small blue clock shaped like a robot that he'd picked out himself. And he was responsible for getting himself up for school, which he took very seriously, and which Nathan found quietly extraordinary. The self-sufficiency of a 7-year-old who had decided that this was something he could manage. The cafe was nearly empty at 5:30. Devin hadn't started yet. The morning shift began at 6, and before 6, it was just Claudette, doing the setup she'd been doing for 21 years. Nathan let himself in with the key he technically owned but rarely used, because using it felt like announcing what he was, and made himself coffee at the counter the way Claudette had shown him once, during a slow Sunday years ago. He was sitting at the back table with his coffee when Claudette came through from the kitchen at 20 to 6 and stopped when she saw him. "You're early," she said. "Couldn't sleep." She looked at him with the direct assessment she reserved for things she'd decided not to be gentle about. "You're not doing well," she said. "I'm fine." "I didn't ask if you were fine. I said you're not doing well. Those are different things." He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. It was the first time he'd held his cup that way, both hands all the way around it, the way Lena always held hers. And he noticed it, and it cost him something. "I should have done more," he said, "months ago. I could see she was—" He stopped. "I respected what she wanted, and I'm not sure that was right." Claudette pulled out the chair across from him, Lena's chair, and sat down. This was twice now that she'd done this, and both times it had meant something. "She didn't want to be managed," Claudette said. "You understood that." Understanding it and being comfortable with it are different things. "Yes, they are." Claudette folded her hands on the table. Her hands were large and capable, the hands of someone who had made thousands of things and carried more than that. "But you hear me. A woman like Lena who has spent years being looked through by people. Being seen is already something. You gave her that every morning. Don't diminish it because you wanted to give more." He was quiet. "The more you're talking about," Claudette said, "the hospital bills, the housing, all the things you wanted to fix. You think she didn't know you could fix them?" He looked up. "She knew," Claudette said simply. "She knew from the first month. You're not a subtle man about who you are, Nathan, whatever you might think. She figured it out." He sat with that. "She never said." "No, she never asked for it either." Claudette was quiet for a moment. Some people, by the time they're where she is, asking for help from someone who has the power to give it doesn't feel like relief. It feels like losing the last thing that's still yours. He understood that. He understood it in a way that went beyond the words, that touched something from the years before the money, when he'd been the one doing math before ordering, the one who knew exactly how close the edge was, the one for whom accepting help from someone with more felt like surrendering something that wasn't replaceable. "She let me pay for her breakfast," he said. "Because she could tell herself it was the cafe, not you," Claudette said, "and because she was hungry, and that's stronger than pride. But the rest of it—" She shook her head. "The rest of it was hers." He drank his coffee. The cafe was quiet. Outside, the city was just starting to wake up, the first delivery trucks rumbling past, the first lights coming on above the dry cleaner that was never open. "She's not coming back, is she?" he said. Claudette looked at him steadily. "I don't know," she said. "I truly don't. But I think you should be ready for that." He nodded. Once. The nod of someone accepting information they'd already calculated and hadn't wanted to confirm. He stayed at the back table until Devin came in at 6 and the cafe filled up, and the morning moved through its ordinary paces, and he sat there through all of it, present and absent at the same time. The way you are when something is waiting that you can't do anything about. It was a Thursday morning, 11 days after she'd stopped coming in, that Claudette called him. He was at his desk. It was just past 8. He picked up on the first ring, which he almost never did. Claudette said, "Nathan," and stopped. The single word and the stop was enough. He closed his eyes for a moment. "When?" he said. "Yesterday evening," Claudette said. A woman named Rosario called me this morning. She'd been helping Lena with some things, practical things. She said Lena had asked her to call me if... Claudette stopped again. When she continued, her voice was careful in the way of someone holding something very fragile. It was her heart. She'd had a condition for a long time. Years, I think. He said nothing. She wasn't in pain at the end, Claudette said. That's what Rosario said. I thought you'd want to know that. He sat at his desk in the office on the 34th floor with the city spread out behind him through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and he held the phone and said nothing for a long moment. There was nothing useful to say. He was aware of this. He was aware of other things too. The steadiness of the surface he was sitting on, the weight of his hands on the desk, the particular sound of the city through the glass, which was a sound that never stopped, that had been going when he arrived and would be going when he left, utterly indifferent. "Thank you for calling me," he said. "Of course," Claudette said. He put the phone down. He sat. Priya knocked at 12:30 with a sandwich he hadn't asked for and set it on the desk without comment and left. He ate it at his desk, tasting almost nothing, looking at the wall. At 2, his phone lit up with a call from Garrett about the quarterly numbers, and he answered it and managed the conversation on autopilot. The part of his brain that ran those functions operated on a track separate from wherever he was at that moment. He gave Garrett what he needed. The call ended. He went back to the wall. He went home early. Marcus was at school. The apartment was quiet. He sat at the kitchen counter with the black notebook open in front of him and looked at the pages and didn't read them. After a while, he turned to a blank page and picked up a pen and stayed there for a long time, trying to figure out what to write. He didn't write anything. He closed the notebook and went to pick up Marcus from school, which he hadn't done in several weeks because the schedule usually made it impossible, and Marcus came out of the building and saw him at the curb and stopped for a full second, just stood there with his backpack and his dinosaur keychain and his face doing the math, and then walked over and didn't say anything but took his father's hand, which he sometimes did and sometimes didn't, depending on some private calculation Nathan had never fully decoded. They walked to get ice cream, which was not a school day ritual and was therefore understood by Marcus to be significant. In some way he didn't question. He ordered something involving 3 colors of ice cream and what appeared to be a structural amount of sprinkles. Nathan ordered coffee ice cream in a cup, which Marcus evaluated with the look of someone encountering a preventable tragedy. "You could have gotten something good," Marcus said. "I got something good." "You got the sad flavor." Coffee ice cream is not the sad flavor. "It's the color of sad," Marcus said with the conviction of someone who had clearly thought about this. Nathan ate his ice cream and said nothing, and Marcus ate his ice cream and said without looking up, "Is something wrong?" Nathan looked at his son, 7 years old, sprinkles on his nose. "Someone I knew passed away," Nathan said. Marcus was quiet. He was processing. You could see it the way he went slightly still when he was thinking carefully. "Someone from work?" he said. "Someone from the cafe," Nathan said. "The one I go to in the mornings." Marcus considered. "The one where you always come home smelling like good coffee?" "That one." Another silence. Marcus took a careful bite of his ice cream. "Were they nice?" he asked. "Very," Nathan said. "Were they your friend?" "Yes," Nathan said, which was the first time he'd used that word about Lena out loud. He'd thought it many times. He hadn't said it. Saying it now in the past tense, sitting outside an ice cream shop with his 7-year-old son on a Thursday afternoon in June, cost him something he hadn't expected. Marcus scooted his chair slightly closer to Nathan's on the small sidewalk table. He didn't say anything else. He just ate his ice cream and let the closeness be what it was. Nathan looked at his coffee ice cream in the cup and thought, "This is the color of sad." He ate it anyway. The letter arrived 9 days later. He was at home on a Saturday morning when the buzzer sounded. Marcus was watching something on the tablet in his room, a nature documentary about deep-sea creatures that he'd been working through episode by episode with the methodical focus he applied to things he was serious about. Nathan went to the lobby and found a woman he didn't know standing in the entrance. She was in her late 50s, small and dark-haired, wearing a raincoat over what looked like a Sunday dress on a Saturday, carrying a large envelope and a small flat package wrapped in brown paper. "Mr. Mercer?" she said. "Yes." "My name is Rosario Vega," she said. "I was a friend of Lena Carter's." He looked at her. She had the calm face of someone who had been sitting with grief long enough that it had settled into something she could carry. Her eyes were tired but steady. "Please come up," he said. They sat at the kitchen table. He made coffee. Rosario Vega wrapped her hands around the mug the way Lena had always wrapped hers, and he noticed this and felt the noticing land somewhere specific. Rosario explained in the measured way of someone who had prepared what she was going to say. She had known Lena for 3 years, from the transitional housing complex where they'd both lived for a period. Rosario had since moved to a small apartment nearby, but she'd stayed in touch. She had helped Lena with appointments toward the end, doctors mostly, some paperwork. She had a congenital heart condition, Rosario said. She'd known about it for years. The last 18 months were when it started getting serious. She paused. She didn't like to talk about it. "I know," Nathan said. Rosario looked at him. "She talked about you," she said. "Not as an accusation, just as a fact. Quite a bit toward the end." He said nothing. "She left instructions about a few things," Rosario continued. "Most of it was simple. She didn't have much, but she was very specific about this. She placed the large envelope on the table and then the flat package in brown paper. She said the envelope first and then the package." He looked at the envelope. His name was on it in handwriting he'd never seen before. Her handwriting, clean and slightly leftward-leaning, unhurried. "Should I—" he started. "I can give you privacy," Rosario said. She was already standing. "You don't have to leave." "I think she'd want you to read it alone," Rosario said, with the certainty of someone who had known Lena well enough to be right about this. She carried her mug to the counter and went to stand at the kitchen window and looked out at the city, giving him the room. He opened the envelope. There were 6 pages, handwritten on lined paper from the kind of notebook you bought at a drugstore. The writing was the same as the outside of the envelope. Clean, slightly leftward-leaning, steady. Whatever she'd been going through when she wrote this, her hand had been steady. He read it through once, quickly, the way you read something when you're not sure you can hold it together if you slow down. Then he went back to the beginning and read it again. She wrote that she had started meaning to write the letter in February after a conversation with Rosario in which Rosario had said, bluntly, that there were things Lena was going to want to have said and that she should say them while she could. She said she had written 3 earlier drafts and thrown all of them away because they came out sounding either sentimental or like an apology, and she didn't want either. She wrote that she had been in a very dark period of her life when she found Birch and Grounds. She didn't elaborate on the specifics. She said only that she had lost her apartment in November of the previous year, had been staying in transitional housing, and had found the cafe because it was warm and close, and Claudette had never once looked at her the way some places looked at people who came in with very little and stayed a long time. She wrote about the breakfast. She was precise about it in a way he hadn't expected. She wrote that the morning she'd come in soaked through and been brought the full breakfast, she'd known immediately that it wasn't a cafe promotion or a kitchen mistake, and that she'd made a decision to accept it without asking because she was wet and cold and hungry, and sometimes those facts outweigh everything else. She wrote that afterward she'd spent 2 days being privately embarrassed about it, and then decided the embarrassment was less useful than the food, and let it go. She wrote, "You never asked me to be grateful." That was the thing. Most people who help someone without money want something back, even if it's just the feeling of having helped. You just kept doing it. And you talked to me like I was interesting, not like a problem you were being patient about, like I was actually worth the time. He stopped reading for a moment. He looked at the kitchen window where Rosario was standing with her back to him, looking out at the city. He kept reading. She wrote about the restaurant idea. She wrote that when he had described it, the corkboard, the colored cards, the no questions, no paperwork, she had felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, which she described not as hope, which she said was too large a word for what it was, but more like recognition. Like she had heard a description of something that was supposed to exist and hadn't yet. She wrote, "I don't know if you know this, but I've sat on the other side of that wall you're building. Not literally. But I've been in the room where the question of whether you deserve to eat is somehow complicated. where the help comes with a form or a caseworker or an explanation you have to give of yourself before you're allowed to have what you need. And I want to tell you that what you described, the version where nobody has to explain themselves, that is not a small thing. That is not just a good restaurant concept. That is a way of saying that someone matters before they've proven it. Please don't let it become something else. Please don't let people talk you into making it cleaner or more systematic or more efficient. Keep the board handmade. Keep the cards warm colors. Keep the room all one room. He read that paragraph 3 times. She wrote toward the end about Marcus. She wrote that she'd never met him and that she felt like she knew him anyway, which was a strange thing to say, and she said she was aware it was strange. She wrote that she thought he was going to be the kind of person who paid attention, and that the world needed more of those, and that Nathan should tell him so, in case he didn't know. She wrote, in the last paragraph, "I'm not writing this because I want you to be sad. I'm writing it because you gave me something during the worst chapter of my life, and I want you to know it mattered. Not the food, though the food mattered. The fact that you sat down, the fact that you kept coming back, the fact that you talked to me about your restaurant and your son and your 9-year-old dream like they were real things worth saying out loud. You have no idea how rare that is. I hope you always do that. I hope you do it for everyone." The letter ended there. No closing sentiment, no signature, even, just the last word, everyone, and then the bottom of the page. He sat with it for a while. Then he set it down carefully on the table, the pages in order, the way it had been before he'd opened it. "Rosario," he said. She turned from the window. "Sit down," he said. "Please." She came back to the table and sat. He was quiet for a moment, arranging something that he didn't have the right words for yet. "How long did you know her?" he said. 3 years this spring," Rosario said. "We met at the housing complex. I'd been there 2 months. She'd been there about a week. She helped me figure out the medication assistance application. Very practical woman, very patient with paperwork, which I am not." A brief, real smile. "We had dinner together a few times a month after I moved out. She came to my apartment. I cooked." "Did she eat?" Rosario looked at him. "At the end, she didn't eat much," she said honestly, "but she always said it was good." He nodded. He picked up the small package in brown paper. "She said that one too," Rosario confirmed. He unwrapped it. It was a notebook. Not the drugstore-lined paper she'd used for the letter. This was a nicer one, the kind with a soft cover in dark blue, the pages cream-colored and slightly heavier. It was full. He could see from the thickness of it that nearly every page was used. He opened it to the first page. The first entry was dated from the previous October. 3 days after the morning, she'd come in soaked from the rain. 3 days after the breakfast she'd known wasn't a promotion. He read 2 paragraphs and then closed the notebook. Not because he didn't want to read it. Because he understood, looking at the handwriting on those first 2 paragraphs, that this was something that was going to require him to be somewhere he could fall apart a little, and he wasn't there yet. "She wrote in it every day, toward the end," Rosario said. "She told me she was writing down the things that still seemed worth writing down." He held the notebook in both hands. From down the hall, Marcus's room was quiet. The nature documentary had apparently ended, or he was between episodes. In a moment, he'd probably appear in the kitchen doorway with some fact about an anglerfish or a bioluminescent jellyfish that he was going to deliver with the intensity of breaking news. "She had good days and bad days," Rosario said, "but the mornings at the cafe, those were always a good day. She'd come back and tell me about the conversations, about the restaurant." Rosario paused. "She said you had a notebook too." "I did," he said. "I do." She'd be glad to know that. He looked at the notebook in his hands, dark blue cover, cream pages, her handwriting on every page. Everything she'd found worth writing down. "I'm going to make sure the restaurant opens," he said. It wasn't a statement designed for Rosario. It was more like saying it out loud to make it a different kind of real. "October, that was the plan." Rosario nodded. "I'd like you to come," he said, "when it opens." She looked at him, slightly surprised, and then not surprised. "I'd like that," she said. Marcus appeared in the doorway exactly as predicted, holding the tablet, face arranged in the expression of someone with information to deliver. He took in Rosario with the unabashed assessment of a 7-year-old. Hi, he said. Hi, Rosario said. You must be Marcus. He looked at his father. She knows my name. She was a friend of my friend, Nathan said. Marcus processed this. He came fully into the kitchen and set his tablet on the counter and looked at Rosario with the particular seriousness he deployed when he had decided someone was worth paying attention to. Did you know the person who passed away? He asked. I did, Rosario said. She was a good person. Marcus nodded. He opened the refrigerator. He got out the orange juice and poured himself a glass with the focused attention of someone managing a complex task. He put the juice back. He picked up his glass and looked at Rosario and said, with complete sincerity, I'm sorry for your loss. He'd learned the phrase recently. Nathan wasn't sure where. He'd been deploying it with the gravity of someone who understood it meant something and was not to be said lightly. Rosario looked at Marcus for a moment, and her steady, careful face did something complicated. Thank you, she said. That's very kind. Marcus nodded, satisfied that the appropriate thing had been said, and went back down the hall with his orange juice. Nathan watched him go. He notices things, Rosario said softly. I know, Nathan said. Somebody told me. He looked down at the notebook in his hands, the dark blue cover, the cream pages. All the days of a woman he had known in morning-sized installments, written down in her particular leftward-leaning hand offered to him because she'd decided he was worth the telling. He held it carefully. The way you hold something you understand the weight of. Outside, the June city moved through its Saturday, ordinary, ongoing, indifferent to most things, as cities are. But in the kitchen of a 4,200-square-foot apartment on the 34th floor, a man sat at a table with a letter and a notebook and the cooling remains of 2 cups of coffee, and felt the full weight of what it meant to have been seen by someone who had very little reason left to see anything. He would read the notebook that night after Marcus was asleep. He would sit in the kitchen in the dark with Lena Carter's words, and he would read every page, and for the first time in years, the billionaire who seemed to have everything would cry. Not the brief managed emotion of someone who had learned to process things efficiently, but the kind of crying that surprised you, that came from somewhere older than you expected, that meant something you couldn't manage your way out of. But that was still hours away. For now, he sat. He held the notebook. He stayed with it, the way she had stayed with everything that was given to her, carefully, deliberately, making sure none of it was wasted. He read the notebook in one sitting. He told himself he would read a few pages that night, after Marcus was asleep, just enough to understand what it was before deciding how to approach it. That was the plan. He sat down at the kitchen counter at 9:45 with the dark blue notebook and a glass of water and the reasonable intention of a man who managed things at a measured pace. And he read the first entry, and then the second, and then he stopped managing anything at all and just read. She wrote the way she talked. That was the first thing he noticed, the same directness, the same absence of self-pity, the same occasional dry observation delivered without setup. There were no grand meditations on suffering or meaning. There were no passages where she addressed the universe or tried to make sense of what was happening to her by placing it in a larger frame. She wrote about specific days, specific moments, what the light had been like that morning, what she'd overheard at the bus stop, what she'd eaten for dinner, and whether it had been worth the effort. She wrote about the cafe regularly, about Claudette, who she described in one entry as the kind of woman who makes coffee like it's an argument she intends to win, and she is always right. About Devin, who she observed was studying for something important based on the textbook she'd seen him reading on his break, and the particular expression of a person memorizing things they don't fully believe yet. About the man who ordered 2 coffees and never drank them, who she had apparently also noticed and had her own theory about. She thought he was ordering for someone who was no longer alive, and that the second cup was a kind of conversation he didn't know how to stop having. Nathan sat with that observation for a long time. She wrote about him. Not constantly, and not in the way he might have expected. She didn't write about gratitude as a theme. She wrote about specific things he'd said, sometimes quoting him directly, the words sitting in her handwriting, strange and familiar at once. She wrote about the morning he'd told her about the restaurant, about the corkboard and the colored cards, and described it as the first time in months she'd felt genuinely curious about something, which she said was different from interested and more important. One entry, dated early December, read, "He's a person who built something enormous and is embarrassed by it in a specific way. Not embarrassed that it exists, but embarrassed by what people assume it means about him. He keeps the old alarm time from when he was broke. He wears the boots until they fall apart. He thinks if he holds on to those things, he's still the person he was before. And maybe he is. I can't tell if that's wisdom or stubbornness. Maybe both. Maybe they're the same thing." He read that 3 times. He thought about the boots. He looked down. He was wearing them right now. The same ones she'd apparently noticed. He'd had them resold twice. They were not the boots of a billionaire. They were the boots of someone who couldn't make himself throw away the last physical object that still felt like evidence of where he'd started. She was right. He didn't know if it was wisdom or stubbornness either. She wrote about her body in the later entries, matter-of-factly, about the medication adjustments that made her tired in the afternoons, about the appointment in February that had given her a timeline the doctor had been careful to frame as a range rather than a deadline, which she described as the medical profession's version of softening something that can't actually be softened. About the decision she'd made after that appointment, which she didn't name directly, but which she described as having made a few things simpler and a few other things harder. She wrote, "I told Rosario today. She cried, which I expected, and then she made dinner, which I also expected because Rosario processes things through feeding people. I ate as much as I could. The soup was very good." He smiled at that. Briefly, in the dark kitchen at 1:30 in the morning, he smiled at Lena Carter's dead reckoning of a friend who processed grief through soup. The last entry was dated 8 days before she stopped coming to the cafe. It was shorter than most. She wrote, "Mornings are harder now. Getting there takes a lot. But I keep going because I want to see how the Nathan thing ends. The restaurant. I want to know it's going to be real. I think it is. I think he's further along than he lets on, even to himself. He always undersells how ready he is for things, probably because he's been let down by his own readiness before. I understand that. But I think this one's going to be real. I want it to be real." He closed the notebook. He sat in the kitchen for a long time. The city outside was quieter at this hour, but never truly quiet. There was always something, a siren somewhere, a truck, the ambient mechanical hum of a city that never completely stopped. He'd lived his whole life in cities and had stopped hearing it years ago. He heard it now. He thought about her last entry, about the phrase "the Nathan thing," the casual ownership of it, the way she'd folded his project into her frame of reference as if it were something she was tracking, something that partially belonged to her. Not because she'd claimed it, but because she'd cared about it in the particular way that made something partly yours. He thought, I owe her a real thing. He got up. He went to the counter where he'd left the black notebook, his own, the planning notebook, and he opened it to the current page and he wrote, at 2 a.m. on a Sunday morning in late June, a single line. It's going to be real. And it's going to be right. He went to bed. He slept badly but completely, which was different from not sleeping. And in the morning, Marcus was already up and had made himself cereal and was watching the anglerfish documentary again when Nathan came into the kitchen. And the morning was ordinary in all the ways mornings needed to be. He went to Meridian Street after dropping Marcus at school. Ray Solis was already there, which was not unusual because Ray arrived unreasonably early and considered this a moral virtue. He was standing in the middle of the dining room with his clipboard looking at the ceiling with the expression of a man who had found something he was hoping not to find. Tell me, Nathan said. Ceiling's fine, Ray said. I'm just thinking. That's an alarming face for thinking. I think good thoughts aggressively. Ray lowered his gaze from the ceiling to Nathan. You look terrible. I've been told. Ray nodded. He was not a man who pushed on personal things. Menu board, he said. Claudette's nephew is coming Thursday to look at the kitchen. He has opinions about the layout. What kind of opinions? The kind you get from someone who's worked in 3 restaurants and thinks that makes them an expert. Ray said this without malice. He said most things without malice, which was one of his qualities Nathan valued. His opinions are actually not bad. He wants to shift the cold station 6 inches east, which gives you 18 more inches of prep space. He drew it out. Show me. Ray showed him. The shift was correct. Nathan could see it immediately. the way the sight lines through the pass-through would improve, the way the prep flow would move without bottleneck during a rush. He approved it on the spot, which made Ray write something down with the satisfaction of a man who had expected resistance and received none. They walked the space together, which Nathan did with Ray every week, a ritual that had started as site management and had become something closer to a shared conversation about what the place was becoming. Ray didn't talk much, but when he talked about buildings, he was precise and honest and occasionally said things that landed in Nathan's planning notebook within the hour. At the back wall, Nathan stopped. The corkboard was installed. He'd seen it before, of course. He'd approved it. He'd watched Sasha mount it. He'd taken the photograph he'd shown Lena. But he stood in front of it now and saw it differently. He saw it as a real wall in a real room that was almost finished, and he thought about Lena's handwriting in the dark blue notebook, the instructions she'd written for him. Keep the board handmade. Keep the cards warm colors. Keep the room all one room. Ray, he said. Yeah. The seating near the back wall. I want it integrated. Ray looked at the wall, then at the room. You said that in April. I'm saying it again. It's already in the plan. I know, I just want to make sure we don't lose it in the execution. Ray wrote something down. He glanced at Nathan sideways in the way he did when he had something to say, and was deciding whether to say it. This place means something to you, he said. Not a question. Yeah, Nathan said. Ray nodded. He wrote something else down. We'll keep the wall right, he said. That was all. It was enough. He called Priya from the car on the way back to the office. I need to set up a foundation, he said. Separately from the restaurant. I've been thinking about it for a few months, and I want to move on it now. A pause. Okay, Priya said, shifting gears in the way she did when something theoretical became operational. What's the scope? Housing assistance, emergency food support, job training, families in crisis. The kind of crisis that looks like a series of bad luck events from the outside and is actually a single broken link that everything else hung on. He paused. I want it to address the period before people fall all the way, the gap between struggling and collapsed. That's where intervention matters, and nobody's paying attention. Priya was quiet for a moment in the way that meant she was writing things down rapidly. Do you have an administrative model in mind, or do you want me to research existing frameworks? Research first, but I want to talk to Rosario Vega before we design anything. He'd been thinking about this since Saturday. Rosario had spent 3 years navigating exactly the systems he was trying to build something adjacent to. She would know where the gaps were. She would know what actually helped and what helped on paper. She has operational knowledge I don't have. Who is she? A woman who knew someone I knew. He looked out the window at the city moving past. She'd be a good person to listen to. I'll get her contact information. I have it already. Another brief pause. Priya understood without it being said that this was personal in a way that had become professional, which was a different thing from professional becoming personal and carried its own particular weight. What do you want to call the foundation? She said. He didn't hesitate. He'd known the answer to this since 2 a.m. on Sunday, when he'd closed the dark blue notebook and sat in the kitchen, in the quiet. Maybe he'd known it before that, in the way you sometimes know something before you have the right moment to confirm it. The Lena Carter Foundation, he said. He could hear Priya stop writing. Okay, she said after a moment. I'll start the paperwork. He went to see Claudette that afternoon. Not in the morning, which was their usual time, their established rhythm. This was different. A Tuesday at 3 p.m., the cafe in its mid-afternoon quiet with 2 customers lingering over laptops, and Devin nowhere to be seen, and Claudette behind the counter doing inventory with the particular focused expression of someone who had been doing inventory for 21 years and had still never learned to enjoy it. She looked up when he came in. Sit down, she said. I'll bring coffee. He sat at the back table. Claudette's table, now. He thought of it differently. Not Lena's table anymore. Not since the June morning he'd understood that she wasn't coming back. Now it was just the table where they sat, where the important things had been said. Claudette brought 2 coffees and sat down across from him. He told her about the foundation. He laid it out the way he'd laid it out for Priya, but with less structural language and more of the actual intention behind it, the gap he was trying to address. the period between struggling and collapsed, the intervention that mattered and didn't exist in any systematic way that he could find. Claudette listened without interrupting, which was how she listened when she was taking something seriously rather than waiting for a place to respond. "Rosario Vega," he said. "I want to bring her in. At whatever level makes sense. She knows things I don't." Claudette nodded. "She's practical," she said. "Real practical. Lena used to say she was the most useful person she knew." "That's exactly what I need." Claudette wrapped her hands around her cup. "You're naming it after her." "Yes." She looked at the table for a moment. Something moved across her face that she didn't try to hide and didn't try to elaborate. Then she said, "She would have found that embarrassing." "I know." "She would have said it was too much." "I know that too." Claudette looked up. "She also would have been glad," she said. "She just wouldn't have said so." He nodded. "The bread arrangement," Claudette said, shifting, not because the previous thing was resolved, but because she was a person who moved through emotions by continuing to work. And he respected that. "My nephew. You met him briefly. His name is Theodore. He goes by Theo. He will not tell you to call him Theo, so you'll have to figure that out on your own. Ray mentioned him. Ray likes him, which means something because Ray doesn't like most people. Theo can run the kitchen. He's better than he thinks he is, which is common at his age." She paused. "He needs something to care about. The caring makes him better." "When can I talk to him properly?" "Thursday. Come at 4. He'll be here." He came at 4 on Thursday. Theo turned out to be 26, quietly intense, with the kind of stillness in a kitchen that told you he'd been doing this long enough that it had become physical knowledge rather than thought. He walked Nathan through what he'd worked out about the Meridian menu. Not a pitch, not a proposal, just a clear accounting of what he thought the food should do and why. Fresh bread twice a day. Soup that required actual time. The kind of soup you couldn't fake. A rotating menu of 4 mains, 2 of which changed weekly depending on what was available and affordable without compromising. Simple desserts, made well, never precious. "The food has to be real," Theo said. He said it like a rule he'd arrived at through experience, not ideology. People who've been eating badly for a long time know the difference between real food and food that's trying to look real. You can't fake it. "Agreed," Nathan said. "And the portions have to be the same," Theo said. "Whatever people pay, and the same plate. Nothing that signals who's on a wall card and who isn't." Nathan looked at him. "Who told you about the wall?" Theo glanced at Claudette, who was behind the counter pretending not to listen. "She told me what it was for," he said. "Not the details, just the idea." "The idea's right," Nathan said. "Same plate, same service, no signals." Theo nodded. He seemed satisfied in the specific way of someone who had asked a test question and received the correct answer. "Okay," he said. "I'm in." It was the simplest negotiation Nathan had completed in years. The renovation finished in early September, which was 2 weeks behind Ray's revised schedule and 3 weeks ahead of the original one, a paradox that Ray described as fine. Nathan walked through it on a Tuesday evening with Ray and Theo and Sasha, who had come back to see the finished space and stood in front of the corkboard with her arms crossed and said, "Yeah, that's right," which was the closest Sasha got to a compliment on her own work. The dining room was not beautiful in the way of designed spaces. It was clean and warm and worn in the right places. They'd kept the old floor with its repaired tiles, kept the window frames that had been there when Dimitrios was making spanakopita in 1987, kept the particular unevenness of the ceiling plaster in the section near the kitchen that Ray had assessed and deemed structurally irrelevant and aesthetically honest. The tables were wood, not matching, acquired from an estate sale and a restaurant closure and a salvage warehouse Priya had found. The chairs were similarly mismatched in a way that didn't look curated. The corkboard was exactly as described, large, practical, handmade looking. On the board, Sasha had mounted a small wooden sign. He hadn't asked her to. She'd done it without telling him, and he'd found it during the walkthrough. A small rectangle of reclaimed wood with 3 words burned into it cleanly. No questions asked. He stood in front of it for a long time. "Too much?" Sasha said. "No," he said. "It's right." Rosario came to see the space on the Wednesday before they opened. He'd been meeting with her monthly since July. first at a coffee shop, then at Priya's office, then by video when her schedule got complicated. She had turned out to be exactly what he'd suspected, a person who knew where the systems failed because she'd been failed by them, who could identify the specific moments where well-intentioned programs stopped being useful without ever losing the practical clarity required to suggest something better. She was going to run the Foundation's Community Liaison program, a title that didn't fully capture what she'd actually be doing, which was serving as the person on the ground who understood what families actually needed as opposed to what looked good in a grant application. She'd been hesitant when he first offered it, which he'd expected. She'd asked pointed questions about salary structure and decision-making authority, which he'd taken as a good sign. She'd called back 2 days later and said yes. She stood in the dining room on Wednesday afternoon and turned slowly, taking in the whole space. She stopped at the corkboard. She read the small sign. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "She would have sat at that table." She pointed to the one closest to the back wall, slightly to the left near the window. He looked at the table. It was a corner table. Good window. Slightly out of the main sight line of the room, which gave you a view of the whole space without being in the middle of it. "Why that one?" he said. "She always sat where she could see everything without being looked at," Rosario said. She was like that. He stood there and thought about October almost a year ago now, a woman at the back table near the window, wearing a worn-out jacket, counting coins. The stillness of her. The particular way she took up exactly the space she needed and no more. "It'll be her table," he said. "I won't put a sign on it, but we'll keep it open." Rosario looked at him. "She'd tell you that was sentimental." "I know." "She'd also like it." "I know that too." He had not planned a grand opening. The restaurant on Meridian opened on a Thursday in mid-October with no press release and no event and no social media announcement beyond a single post from the cafe's account, Claudette's account technically, that said simply, "The place on Meridian is open. Go eat." Below it, an address. He'd told Priya not to generate coverage. She'd looked at him the way she looked at him when she thought he was making an error but had decided to respect the decision. "The Foundation has a launch event in November," she said. "You'll get coverage then." "That's fine," he said. "This isn't about coverage." "What is it about?" He thought about that for a moment. "Seeing if it works," he said. The first day they served 43 people. 11 of those meals were from the wall. Theo's bread was what Nathan had known it would be. The kind of bread that made you understand why bread was the thing, the primary thing. The thing humans had been making for thousands of years with good reason. The soup was a white bean and vegetable, heavy enough for October, honest in the way Theo had described. The service was handled by 3 people Nathan had hired through a workforce re-entry program, 2 women and a man, all of whom had spent various periods of the previous year navigating systems that Rosario had helped him understand in specific terms. They were not polished. One of them, a woman named Adriana, dropped a water pitcher in the first hour and handled it with a frankly impressive composure that Nathan noted and later told Priya about. He was there all day. Not managing. He stayed out of the kitchen and out of the service flow. He sat at the counter near the pass-through with his coffee and his black notebook and watched. He watched how people entered the space and looked around before sitting. He watched the moment when people who came in with wall cards took them from the board. The small private gesture of it, the way nobody looked at them doing it, not performatively, but naturally, because the room was set up so that the natural thing was also the right thing. He watched a man come in alone and sit at a table and eat a full meal and leave without speaking to anyone. And he watched the way the man's shoulders had been when he came in versus when he left, which was different. At 4 p.m. Shasham, the quiet hour between lunch and dinner, when Theo and the crew were prepping and the dining room was empty, Nathan sat at the table Rosario had identified as Lena's table. He'd been avoiding it all day. Not consciously, or maybe consciously. He'd moved around the room and had not sat there. Now he sat there. He put his hands flat on the table. The wood was warm from the afternoon light through the window. From this angle he could see the whole dining room, the tables, the counter, the pass-through, the corkboard on the back wall with its colored cards in yellow and orange. He could see the door, and the street through the glass, and the October light that came in sideways, the way it always did in October, making everything look like it was happening a little more slowly and a little more carefully than usual. He sat there for a while. He thought about what Claudette had said back in February, in the early morning cafe. Being seen is already something. You gave her that every morning. He thought about the line from the letter. You talked to me like I was interesting, not like a problem you were being patient about. He thought about the last entry in the dark blue notebook. I want it to be real. He took out the black notebook. He opened it to a new page. He wrote the date, October, the restaurant's first day. And then he wrote, 43 today, 11 from the wall. Theo's bread was right. Adriana dropped a pitcher and didn't flinch. The room works. She was right about the room. He stopped. He read what he'd written. Then he wrote one more line. The table by the window is the right table. He closed the notebook. From the kitchen, he could hear Theo moving through the prep, the steady rhythmic sound of someone working with purpose. From the street, ordinary October traffic. From somewhere above him, the buildings settling in the way old buildings settled in the cold. Not dramatically, but constantly, small adjustments against the weight of what they were holding. He sat at the table by the window and felt the particular quality of a thing that had been imagined for a long time and was now, simply, real. Priya had scheduled the foundation launch for early November, a gathering of potential donors, community partners, city officials who'd expressed interest, and representatives from the organizations they planned to work alongside. Not a gala, at his specific insistence. A working meeting in a rented space downtown, catered by Theo's crew, structured around concrete presentations of what the foundation intended to do and how it intended to do it. He had agreed to give brief remarks. He'd written and rewritten them 3 times in the weeks leading up to it. Each draft was technically fine and felt somehow wrong, which was a feeling he had learned to take seriously because it usually meant the draft was solving for the wrong problem. He was trying to explain the foundation in terms of impact and mission and deliverable outcomes, which were the right terms for the audience and the completely wrong frame for what the foundation was actually about. He was at the cafe on the morning of the launch, back to his old habit, 5:30 a.m., counter seat, the particular early morning quiet that had become load-bearing in his daily life. Claudette brought his coffee, and he sat with it and the notebook and the wrong draft of the remarks in front of him. He crossed out everything he'd written. He sat for a while. He wrote, Last October, I started paying attention to a woman I didn't know. I didn't do it for any particular reason. She was there, and she was a person, and it seemed like the natural thing. He stopped. He read it. It was true, which meant it was right, which meant it was the beginning of the actual thing he needed to say. He wrote for 40 minutes. Claudette refilled his coffee once without commenting on the state of the page. Devin came in at 6 and ran the morning service and left him alone. The cafe filled and thinned. When he was finished, he read the whole thing through. It was not polished. It had at least 2 sentences that he would normally have cut on the grounds of being too direct. It named Lena by name, which he had been uncertain about and decided to do because her name deserved to be said in a room full of people who had the resources to do something about the gap she'd fallen through. He left the cafe at 7:15 and went to the office and told Priya he had the remarks. She asked to see them. She read them standing at her desk. He watched her face. Priya had an extremely controlled face in professional contexts, and it was therefore meaningful when something broke through. Something broke through twice, briefly, while she was reading. She handed the pages back. Don't change anything, she said. The second paragraph is rough. Don't change anything, she said again. He didn't change anything. He stood at the front of the rented room that evening with 70 people in chairs in front of him, donors and city officials and nonprofit directors, and Rosario, sitting in the second row with her hands in her lap and the careful, steady face that had become familiar to him, and Claudette, who had been given a seat in the front row and had immediately moved to the third row because she said the front row made her feel like she was in trouble. And he read what he'd written. He told them about a woman at the back table in a cafe, about counting coins, about a worn-out jacket, about the way someone could become the most important part of your morning without either of you planning it. He told them about the restaurant idea, the one he'd had at 23 and done nothing about, and about the first time he'd described it to someone and she'd asked what color the cards were going to be. He told them that the restaurant had opened 3 weeks ago and that on the first day 11 people had eaten from the wall and that nobody had asked them to explain themselves and that this was not a small thing. He told them that the Lena Carter Foundation existed because one woman had carried an enormous weight alone and had done it with a specificity and a dignity that had taught him more about what actually mattered than any success he'd achieved in a professional context. He told them that the foundation's purpose was to address the moment before the fall, not the aftermath, but the gap, the specific window where a single intervention could change what happened next. He said, "She never asked me for anything. I'm asking you, on her behalf, to help us do something she would have said was too much and secretly believed was exactly right." He looked up from the page. The room was quiet in the way rooms got quiet when people were paying full attention, not the polite quiet of an audience performing attentiveness, but the actual kind. Rosario, in the second row, had her hands flat on her knees and her chin slightly up and her expression entirely steady, which Nathan had come to understand was what she looked like when something had gotten through her composure and she was holding it together by deciding to. Claudette, in the third row, was looking at the ceiling. He'd noticed she did this when she didn't want her face to show what her face was doing. He said, "Thank you," and stepped back from the podium. The room started breathing again. Afterward, during the reception, Rosario found him near the back of the room. "The part about the cards," she said, "what color they were going to be." "Yeah." "That's what she asked you the first time you described it?" "First real conversation about it," he said. "She wanted to know what the wall looked like." Rosario shook her head slowly. "That's so like her," she said. "Everyone else would have asked if it was going to make money. She asked about the wall." "She was interested in the right things," he said. Rosario looked at him. "So are you," she said. It landed simply the way Lena had said things. Informative, not decorative. He accepted it the way he'd learned to accept the things that were simply true. "We're going to need to meet next week," he said. "The first round of housing assistance applications is ready for review. I want your assessment before we finalize the criteria." "Tuesday," she said. "Morning. You can buy me coffee." "I know a place," he said. She almost smiled. "I know you do." He got home late that evening. Marcus was asleep already, the blue robot clock showing 10:42 on his bedside table. The constellation comforter pulled all the way up over his head the way he slept in cold weather, one hand dangling with the dinosaur loosely in its grip. Nathan stood in the doorway for the usual extra few seconds. The usual small, extraordinary fact of his son, breathing and present and entirely himself. He went to the kitchen and sat at the counter with the black notebook open in front of him. He looked at the last thing he'd written. "The table by the window is the right table." Below it he wrote one more thing, which took him a while to get right, but when he had it, he knew it was right. "She said I was further along than I let on, even to myself. She was right. She was right about most things. I'm going to keep going, that's all. Just keep going." He closed the notebook. He got up and turned off the kitchen light and went to bed, and the city outside was what it always was, ongoing, indifferent, enormous. But inside the apartment, something had settled that hadn't been settled before. A sense of forward motion that didn't require anything else to be resolved. That was enough on its own. That was, in fact, exactly the right amount. The first winter the restaurant was open, Nathan learned something he hadn't expected to learn. He'd expected the logistics to be hard. He'd expected the supply chain headaches and the staffing gaps and the particular chaos of running a service operation where the variables were never fully controllable. A lesson every restaurateur learns the same way, which is by being surprised by it despite being warned. He'd expected the foundation to have friction in the early months, the friction of a new structure finding its shape, which Rosario had predicted with the calm of someone who'd watched institutions fail and was going to make sure this one didn't. He'd expected all of that. What he hadn't expected was how personal it would be. How often he would be standing in the dining room on Meridian and feel something that he couldn't categorize as professional satisfaction or pride in the work, because it was neither of those things. It was something older and quieter than that. Something that had to do with watching a man eat a meal in peace, when peace was not something the man had a lot of lately, or watching a woman come in with two small children and sit at a table and not have to explain anything to anyone, and seeing the specific relief of that. The relief of not having to explain yourself is a precondition for being fed. He hadn't expected how much that would matter to him, how much it would cost him to see it, every time, and also how much it would give back. By December, the restaurant was serving 90 people on a good day. The wall had become something the regulars, the paying customers who came for the bread and the rotating menu and the atmosphere that was unpolished in the right ways, participated in quietly and consistently. There was a couple who came every Friday and always paid for 4 extra meals. Nathan had never spoken to them directly, but he'd seen them at the board taking cards and adding new ones, with the matter-of-fact ease of people for whom this had already become habit, a habit they didn't need to announce. Theo had settled into the kitchen with the focused intensity he applied to everything and had stopped being tentative about the menu and started being decisive about it, which had improved everything by measurable degrees. He'd added a second soup option in November because someone had mentioned a shellfish allergy, and Theo had apparently taken that as a personal challenge to the completeness of the offering. He baked the bread at 5 a.m., and it was ready when the doors opened at 7, and the smell of it, honest and warm and not trying to be anything other than bread, reached the sidewalk, and people sometimes stopped on the sidewalk and then came in, and sometimes they had money, and sometimes they didn't, and that was fine either way. Adriana, who had dropped the water pitcher on the first day with the composure of a person who had survived harder things than a dropped pitcher, had become something close to the heart of the front of house. She was not smooth. She was never smooth. She forgot orders sometimes, got names wrong occasionally, and had once, memorably, given a man a bowl of soup that was not his order, and then argued with him for 30 seconds before realizing he was right. A moment she'd recounted to Nathan with a self-deprecating accuracy that made him like her more rather than less. But she remembered people. She remembered what they'd had last time and whether they'd liked it. And if someone came in looking bad, she noticed, and she handled it without ceremony, which was exactly the quality the place needed most. She'd told Nathan once, in December, that she'd been in a place like this before Meridian, on the other side of it. Not exactly like this, she said, handing him a coffee across the counter in the mid-afternoon quiet. The one I went to had a sign on the door that said Community Meals Program in big letters that you could read from the street, and I didn't go back after the first time because I couldn't stand to be seen going in. He heard the echo of something familiar in that, the signage that told you what category you were before you'd had a chance to be anything else. "Does this feel different?" he asked. Adriana looked around the dining room, at the tables that didn't match, at the corkboard with its warm-colored cards, at the window where the December light came through at an angle that made the whole room look warmer than it was. "Yeah," she said, "it feels like a restaurant." She said it simply, like that was the whole answer, and it was. He wrote that down in the black notebook that evening. It feels like a restaurant. That's the whole thing. That's what she meant. The Foundation's first full quarter of operation had processed 47 families through the Housing Assistance Program, which was below the projected number and above what Rosario had privately told him to realistically expect. "The systems are slow," she'd said at their Tuesday morning meeting in early December, with the specificity of someone reporting field conditions rather than making excuses. "Not our systems, the city's systems. We're doing the intake right and we're doing the advocacy right, but the downstream infrastructure is full of delays we can't control." She'd put 3 documents on the table outlining where the delays were occurring and 2 proposals for working around them. Both proposals were good. He approved them both. He'd learned to approve Rosario's proposals quickly because her proposals were almost always right, and any time he'd slowed down to second-guess them, he'd arrived at the same place anyway and lost 2 weeks. The job training program had placed 19 people in stable employment since September. 19 was a number that could look small in a quarterly report and felt enormous when you knew what it represented. Not just jobs, but the specific mechanics of stability, health insurance, and reliable income, and the psychological shift of having somewhere to be that expected you, which was its own category of thing that nobody put in the metrics but everybody who understood poverty understood mattered. One of the 19 was a man named Curtis, who Rosario had flagged in October as a priority case, and who had spent 11 months prior to the foundation's intervention cycling through temporary work and 2 separate eviction proceedings and a period of couch surfing that he described, when he talked about it, with the minimizing language of someone who had learned that describing the full weight of something made other people uncomfortable, and uncomfortable people were less likely to help. Curtis was now working a facilities management position at a hospital across town. He'd sent a note to the foundation's intake coordinator, not an email, an actual handwritten note on a card, that said simply, "I didn't think this was going to be a real thing. Thank you for being a real thing." Rosario had put the card on the small corkboard above her desk in the foundation office, which was a converted storage room in the building next to the restaurant on Meridian. Nathan had acquired the adjacent space in October when the lease came available, partly for expansion, and partly because having the foundation physically connected to the restaurant felt right in a way he didn't need to justify. She'd shown Nathan the card in passing one morning. He'd read it standing in the doorway of her office. "I didn't think this was going to be a real thing." He thought about Lena's last notebook entry. "I think it is. I want it to be real." He thought about how many people had spent time in the proximity of something that was supposed to help them and had turned out to be something less than real. A form. A wait list. A program that ran out of funding 6 weeks after you'd started to depend on it. He thought about the specific damage that did, not just the practical damage of losing the help, but the other damage, the quieter one, the damage to the part of a person that was still willing to hope that something would work. He stayed in Rosario's doorway a moment longer than he needed to. "We need more funding for the housing track," Rosario said, without looking up from her computer. She always knew when he was standing there. "Tell me the number." "I'll have it to you by Thursday." "Tuesday," he said. She looked up. "Tuesday is our meeting day. Bring it to the meeting." "I was going to." "I know." She gave him the look she reserved for conversations that were technically redundant, but which she tolerated because she'd concluded that Nathan occasionally needed to say things out loud in order to feel that they were real. This was accurate. He'd told her so once, which she'd received without surprise. He went back to the restaurant and sat at the counter with his coffee, and Theo came out of the kitchen to discuss the January menu, which he'd been thinking about since November, and which he presented not as a proposal, but as a decision already made, which Nathan had learned to simply affirm because Theo's decisions about food were reliably correct, and second-guessing them was a waste of both their time. "More root vegetables in January," Theo said. "They're cheaper and they're honest." "Whatever you think," Nathan said. "I always do," Theo said, and went back to the kitchen. January arrived, and the restaurant served 112 people on the first Thursday of the new year, which was a number none of them had planned for, and which created a service situation that Adriana handled with the controlled improvisation of someone who had learned to solve problems in motion rather than stopping to think about them. The bread ran low at lunch. Theo had more in the oven within 15 minutes. The wall was restocked twice before 2 p.m. by customers who'd come in, seen it lower than it should be, and quietly added cards. He watched all of this from the counter and felt something he still didn't have exact words for. Not pride, not satisfaction, not the particular reward of a successful venture. Something more like rightness. The sense that the room was doing exactly what a room was supposed to do, which was hold people. Hold them without conditions, hold them with some warmth, give them the specific dignity of being in a place that expected them to show up and was glad they did. He thought about this on the anniversary. It was a Tuesday in June, 1 year exactly since Claudette had called him at his desk at just past 8 in the morning and said his name and stopped. He'd marked the date in the black notebook when he'd passed it 3 months earlier. Just the date, no other annotation. And now it arrived and he knew what he wanted to do with it. He went to the cafe in the morning, as always. He sat at the counter. Claudette brought his coffee. They didn't talk about it directly. They didn't need to. They sat in the early morning quiet and drank their coffee and existed in the same space, which was what they'd been doing in different configurations for years now. Claudette behind the counter, Nathan at the counter, or at the back table, and for 8 months in between a woman they both missed in the chair by the window. At 6:15, Nathan set some money on the counter and stood up. "Tell Devin I said good morning," he said. "Tell him yourself," Claudette said. "He works in 45 minutes. Tell him anyway. She looked at him over the reading glasses. Where are you going at 6:15? Cemetery, he said. She nodded once. No follow-up. She understood. The cemetery was on the east side of the city, which meant Nathan took the bus. A decision he'd made the first time he'd visited, back in late June of the previous year, when he'd gone for the first time and stood at her grave for 20 minutes and felt the inadequacy of every gesture available to him. The bus felt right in a way the town car didn't. He couldn't have fully explained it, except to say that Lena had ridden the bus, and the bus ran through the part of the city she'd lived in and traveled through and known. And taking it felt like a version of paying attention to the same things she'd paid attention to, which seemed like the right spirit for the day. The cemetery was quiet at 7 a.m. in June. The morning was one of the year's good ones. Clean air, decent light, not yet hot. He walked the path he'd learned over 4 visits and stood at the grave, which had a simple marker that Rosario had arranged, with a name and 2 dates and nothing else. Because when Rosario had asked her once about it, early on, before the end, Lena had said that she didn't want anything that sounded like a summary. Just the name. Just the years. He stood there for a while without saying anything, because he didn't believe in talking to graves as a communication strategy, but he did believe in standing in a place and being present in it, which was something Lena had taught him mostly by doing it herself. The deliberate presence of someone who had decided that if they were going to be somewhere, they were going to actually be there. He thought about the past year. He thought about Theo's bread and Adriana's dropped pitcher and Curtis's handwritten card and the couple who came every Friday and added to the wall. He thought about the 47 families and the 19 people and the Tuesday meetings with Rosario that had become the most practically useful hour of his week. He thought about Marcus, who was 8 now and had recently announced an interest in cooking that was directly traceable to Theo, giving him a tour of the kitchen one Sunday afternoon. A tour that had lasted 2 hours and during which Theo had taught him to cut an onion properly, and Marcus had emerged with slightly red eyes and a sense of deep personal accomplishment. He thought about the table by the window. He'd kept it clear, as he'd told Rosario he would. Not dramatically. No reserved sign, no visible marker. Just the habit of the staff understanding that it was available but not reserved, which in practice meant it was always available and always ready. Some days people sat there. Some days it stayed empty. Either way was fine. The point was that it was there, open, as it had always been. He thought about what Lena had written in the letter. You talked to me like I was interesting, not like a problem you were being patient about. He thought about how long it had taken him to understand what that meant as an instruction rather than a compliment. That it wasn't describing something he'd done for her specifically, but something that had to be done for everyone who came through the door on Meridian. Treated as interesting, as a person worth the attention, before they'd established any claim to it beyond just being there. That was the actual thing. That was what the corkboard and the colored cards and the same plate, same service were all trying to approximate. The experience of being treated as worth the attention before you'd proven it, which was how everyone deserved to be treated, but almost no one was, especially when they had nothing. He stood at the grave for a while longer. Then he said, out loud, one thing, because there was one thing he wanted to say, and he didn't have anywhere better to say it. The restaurant's doing well. Theo's bread is actually incredible. You would have had opinions about it. He stood there a moment longer. Then he walked back down the path to the bus stop. Marcus had a question waiting for him when he got home. This was not unusual. Marcus was at the age where questions arrived in clusters, related to whatever he'd been thinking about during the time Nathan had been gone, and they were delivered without preamble, as if the conversation had already been in progress. Dad, Marcus said from the kitchen, where he was eating cereal with the focused attention of someone who was also thinking about something else. If someone doesn't have money for food, and you give them food, is that charity? Nathan sat down at the counter across from him. What's the difference between charity and not charity, in your opinion? Marcus ate a spoonful of cereal. He was working through it. Charity is when someone needs something, and you give it to them, and they have to be grateful, he said. And the other thing is just when someone needs something and you give it to them. Nathan looked at his son. The difference is whether they have to feel bad about it, Marcus said, arriving at his own conclusion with the directness of someone who had been thinking about this for a while and had reached a position. I think the restaurant is not charity because people don't have to feel bad. That's exactly right, Nathan said. Marcus nodded, satisfied. Also, Theo's bread is really good, he said. I think bread making might be my thing. You've made bread once. It was really good bread. It was good bread, Nathan admitted. Marcus finished his cereal. He put the bowl in the sink, which was a habit Nathan had worked on for 2 years, and which Marcus had recently decided to adopt not because Nathan had asked him to again, but because he'd apparently concluded independently that it was reasonable, which was the only way the habit was going to stick, and Nathan had known this and waited it out. Are we going to the restaurant today? Marcus asked. Later, this afternoon. Can I ask Theo about the bread? You can ask Theo about anything. He'll either answer or tell you he's busy. He's never busy when I ask. This was true, and they both knew it. Theo had developed a particular patience with Marcus that he did not extend to most adults, which Nathan had once pointed out to Theo, and Theo had said, he asks real questions, and returned to his prep work, which was the most complete explanation available. They went to Meridian in the afternoon. It was a Tuesday, between the lunch rush and the dinner service, the quiet, productive hour when the kitchen was in prep mode and the dining room was mostly empty except for a man at a corner table working on a laptop and a woman near the window reading a paperback so intently she hadn't looked up when they came in. Marcus disappeared into the kitchen. Nathan could hear, within 3 minutes, the particular register of Theo's voice that he used for explaining things. Not patient, exactly, because patience implied that the explaining was effortful, but something more like engaged. Theo liked explaining things to people who were genuinely trying to understand them. Marcus was always genuinely trying. Nathan walked through the dining room slowly. He did this sometimes when the room was quiet. Walked it without purpose, just moved through the space and paid attention to how it felt. It had become a kind of check, a calibration. Whether the room still felt like itself, whether anything had drifted. It felt like itself. He stopped at the corkboard. The cards were at a good level, not depleted, not overflowing. The small wooden sign read, "No questions asked," in Sasha's clean burned letters. Below the sign, someone had pinned a small piece of paper. Not a card, just a torn piece of notebook paper, slightly crumpled at the corner with handwriting on it. He hadn't seen it before. He leaned in to read it. It said, "I came here because I didn't have anywhere else to go. I left feeling like a person. Thank you." No name, no date. He stood in front of the board for a long moment. He thought about that phrase. I left feeling like a person. What a thing to need to say. What a thing to not be able to take for granted. The simple fact of leaving a place feeling like a person. What a specific and exact and devastating description of what was missing everywhere else. He unpinned the paper carefully and held it for a moment. Then he pinned it back in the same spot, because whoever had left it had put it there and it belonged there. He went and sat at the table by the window, Lena's table. The woman with the paperback was 2 tables over and still hadn't looked up. The man with the laptop was typing something with the slightly frustrated energy of someone who couldn't find the right word. From the kitchen came the sound of Marcus asking something and Theo answering at length, and then Marcus asking a follow-up, and Theo answering again, and then what sounded like a timer going off and both of them saying, "Oh," at the same time. He sat at the table and looked at the room. He had a habit, in moments like this, of thinking about what Lena would have made of it, not as a way of consulting her or imagining her voice in any specific sense. He was too practical for that kind of thinking, and he suspected she would have found it mildly ridiculous, but as a way of using what he knew about how she saw things to check his own perception. She had been clear-eyed in a way that he was still learning. She had been able to look at something and tell you what it was without telling you what it was supposed to be. And those were different skills, and the second one was much more common and much less useful. So he asked himself, what would she have made of it? He thought she would have sat at this table and looked at the room and made a few specific observations. She would have noted that the bread was right and that the room was all one room, which was what she'd told him to do and which he'd done. She would have noted the note on the corkboard and she would have felt something about it that she wouldn't have made large. She might have said, the person who wrote that needed to say it. That means something worked. She would have had an opinion about the lighting, which was still slightly brighter than he'd originally planned. She would have been right that it should be dimmer. He made a mental note to ask Ray about adjusting the fixtures. She would have approved of Adriana, he thought. The dropped pitcher, especially. She would have liked that Adriana had told him about it honestly, rather than hoping he hadn't noticed. She would have drunk the coffee and pronounced it acceptable, which for her was high praise, and he knew that now. He sat there thinking about this for a while, not as grief exactly. Grief had its own separate register, and he'd spent enough time in it over the past year to know the difference. But as something more like continuing the conversation. The conversation that had started at a counter in October and had never exactly stopped. Rosario arrived at 3:30, which he hadn't planned but also wasn't surprised by. She came by the restaurant on Tuesdays most weeks, partly to check in on the operations they ran out of the adjacent office, and partly, he suspected, because the restaurant was a place where things were working, and it was useful to spend time in places where things were working. She sat across from him at the table by the window with a folder of documents he was going to have to look at, and a coffee she'd poured herself from the service counter in the way of someone who had long since made herself at home. "How is the cemetery?" she said. "Quiet," he said. "Good light." She nodded. She opened the folder and oriented it toward him. "Q2 housing numbers," she said. "We're up to 63 families processed, 31 successful placements." He looked at the numbers. 31. He ran the math. 31 families, average of 2 to 3 members per, which meant somewhere between 60 and 90 people who had a place to sleep tonight that they hadn't had access to without the Foundation's advocacy and assistance. "The holdover cases from March," he said. "The 4 that were stalled on the landlord verification side. 3 resolved, 1 still pending. The 1 pending is complicated by a credit dispute that predates our involvement by 2 years. I have a legal clinic contact who's looking at it." She said this with the tone of someone who had been working a problem from multiple angles and was going to keep working it. "I think we get it by August." "What does she need in the meantime?" "She's in the transitional unit. It's stable. It's just in between. She's good at in between." Rosario said the last part with a particular quality in her voice, the quality of someone who knows what she's describing from the inside. Nathan looked at the document. "Okay," he said. "Keep me updated weekly on that one." "I always do." Marcus emerged from the kitchen at 4 p.m. with flour on his shirt and a small loaf of bread that was irregular in shape and slightly dark on one end and clearly the product of a first serious attempt at something technical. He carried it to the table with the care of someone transporting something fragile and set it down in front of Nathan and Rosario. "Theo let me make a test loaf," he said. He was trying not to look too proud of it, which was itself a sign of pride that was plainly visible. He said the crust is good, but the shape needs work. Nathan picked it up. The crust was in fact good. He could feel it. He broke off a piece. It was dense in a few places and slightly underbaked in the center, and the shape was, as Theo had said, in need of work. It was also absolutely the bread of someone who had paid attention during the process and was going to be good at this with practice. "It's really good," Nathan said. Marcus gave him the look of someone who has been told something nice by a parent and is weighing how much to discount it. Rosario picked up a piece. She ate it. She chewed thoughtfully. "The crust is genuinely good," she said. "That's actually the hard part." Marcus looked at her. He trusted Rosario's assessment more than Nathan's for reasons that were obvious. She had no filial obligation to be kind. "Yeah?" he said. "Ask Theo about hydration ratios next time," she said. "That's where the interior texture comes from." Marcus pulled out his phone and typed something. Nathan watched his son make a note about hydration ratios for bread, standing at a table in a restaurant that existed because a woman who had nothing had asked the right questions at the right time, and felt the particular quality of a moment that was small and enormous at once. "Can I come back Saturday?" Marcus asked. Theo said maybe I can try a proper batch. "Talk to Theo," Nathan said. "If he says yes, yes." Marcus went back to say goodbye to Theo. Rosario watched him go. "He's going to be someone who feeds people," she said. "He's 8. Some things start at 8. She closed the folder. "The Foundation's first annual report is due to the board in September. I want to start drafting in July." "Okay." "I want the numbers, but I also want the stories," she said. "The real ones. Not the cleaned-up versions, Curtis, the woman who's still pending, the ones where it took longer than it should have. She looked at Nathan steadily. People need to know what the work actually is, not the version that makes everyone feel good at a fundraising dinner. Agreed, he said. And I want to include something about Lena, she said. In the report, not hagiography, just who she was, where the foundation came from. He'd thought about this. About how to talk about her without making her into something she would have found embarrassing. A symbol, a narrative device, a lesson made tidy by being placed at the beginning of a success story. She had not been a lesson. She had been a person who had a specific heart condition and a worn-out jacket and a coin purse with a brass clasp and a way of asking questions that went straight to the thing that mattered and didn't bother with the surface. "I'll write it," he said. Rosario looked at him, slightly surprised. He didn't usually write things for the Foundation's public materials. That was Priya's territory. "I'll write it," he said again. "I knew her. It should be me." Rosario nodded. "Send me a draft before it goes to anyone else." "I will." They sat for a moment in the quiet of the mid-afternoon restaurant, with the woman still reading her paperback and the man long gone from the laptop table, and the light doing its October-adjacent thing with the windows, even though it was only June, that particular sideways light that made the room look like it was happening somewhere worth paying attention to. "She would have come here," Rosario said, "to the restaurant, if she'd had more time." "I know. She would have sat at this table." A pause. "She would have said the coffee needed to be stronger." Nathan picked up his cup. The coffee at the restaurant was Claudette's supply, Claudette's roast. Essentially Claudette's coffee served in a different building. It was objectively very good. "She would have been right," he said. Rosario smiled, a full one, rare enough to be significant. She usually was. He was there the following October when a woman came in alone on a Thursday afternoon. He noticed her because she stood inside the door for a moment, not long, just a moment, and looked at the room in the specific way of someone who was checking whether they were going to be made to feel they didn't belong. He knew that look. He'd been watching for it for a year. She walked to the corkboard. She read the small sign. She stood in front of it for a moment, and he watched her reach up and take a card with the quiet, precise movement of someone who had made a decision and was not going to second-guess it. She found a table. A server. Not Adriana, who was off that day, but a man named Luis, who was 6 months in and had learned most of the important things, brought her a menu and water and didn't ask anything that didn't need asking. She ordered the soup and the bread. She ate. She looked out the window at the street for a while, and Nathan, sitting at the counter with his black notebook, couldn't see her face from this angle, only the back of her head and the set of her shoulders, which had changed between when she walked in and now. Between when she walked in and now, something had released. He didn't speak to her. She didn't need to be spoken to. She needed to eat without being asked to explain herself, and she was doing exactly that. And the room was doing exactly what it was supposed to do, and that was the whole point. And the whole point was enough. He opened the black notebook to a blank page. He sat for a moment, thinking about what to write, and then he wrote, Year 2. The room still feels right. 63 families, 31 placements. Marcus's bread is getting better. The shape is improving, and Theo says the interior will follow. Rosario thinks Curtis might come in to talk to the new intake class in September about what the process was actually like. I think he will. He's that kind of person. He stopped. He thought about the note on the corkboard. I left feeling like a person. He wrote, Someone left a note on the board this summer. I didn't take it down. I don't think I ever will. He looked up from the notebook at the room, at the woman with the soup, at the board on the back wall with its warm-colored cards, at the table by the window that was sometimes occupied and sometimes open, both of which were right, at the mismatched chairs and the repaired floor tiles and the ceiling that bore the ghost of its old water damage in a way Ray had called a character mark and Nathan had decided to agree with. He looked at all of it and thought about a woman with a coin purse and a brass clasp, counting what she had and finding it short, and a morning that had changed the direction of everything afterward, not because it was dramatic, but because it was simply a moment of being seen when being seen was what was needed. That was the thing, in the end. Not the money. Not the building on Meridian, or the Foundation's quarterly numbers, or the November launch event, or any of the structures he'd built around the original fact of the thing. Those were all real, and they all mattered. But the original fact was smaller and more durable than any of them. The original fact was that one person had noticed another person and had not looked away, and that the person being seen had noticed being seen, and had written it down, and had carried it forward in a dark blue notebook until she couldn't anymore, and then had passed it to someone who could. Nathan Mercer had started with everything and learned the thing he didn't have from a woman who had almost nothing and understood it completely. He closed the black notebook. The woman with the soup finished eating. She sat for a moment afterward, not in a hurry to leave, just present in the room the way people were when they'd been given a moment to breathe. Then she gathered herself and stood and buttoned her coat and walked to the door and left. And through the window, Nathan watched her move down the street in the October afternoon, straight-backed and ordinary and entirely a person, which was the whole thing, which had always been the whole thing, and which was never, in his experience, as simple as it sounded, and never, in her experience, anything other than everything. The door closed. The small bell above it rang once. The room went on.